well, I haven't, look what it took me to understand. I've been trapped in it.
Right.
It's not been a good thing. It's been a fucking curse. Here I'm supposed to be all this stuff, and I'm thinking, wow, what is it? What is it?
Well, it's all relative. If all that stuff didn't happen in the summer of '69, people would say, look how wonderful his eyes are, and look how wise he is, if you hadn't ended up that way. But now they say, look how evil. So it's all relative.
But the reality is the opposite. I was the dumbest one in the whole group. I went for everybody's story.
Right.
They could tell me anything. Mm-hmm. Please, could I stay here? I said, can you stay here? And they said, yeah. I said, what the fuck you asked me for? What have I got to do with it? You dig? Well, I ain't got nowhere to go. Well, I ain't got nowhere to go either.
Is that Linda or Tex that you're making fun of there?
All of them.
All of them.
All of them. I should try them for murder.
Right. Well, of course.
I should indict them all. So yeah, then you stand
well,
there and tell me to wait.
That was the point I'm trying to make in my book, is they dragged you into this shit. That's obvious.
Well, I mean, they just did what their parents did to them, Like some little girl would run away and she'd come up and say, my parents kicked me out of my house. I got nowhere to go. Can I stay with you?
Mm-hmm. This recorded call is from an inmate at a California correctional.
And here's what I'm guilty of. Can I fuck you? See how you put them on trial?
Well, in a way, they knew how to play the game of lying and bullshit,
Yeah, they learned it from their, and not only that, they had space. I had no space. If you're born without parents, you got no space.
Right. Well, it's like
no position.
That's why Bugliosi and all these people knew these people would snitch and betray you and betray each other,
Well, there's a lot of them that didn't betray.
Right. Some of them didn't, but
yeah, there's a lot of them that didn't. Most of them didn't.
Yeah.
There's some good people in that group.
I welcome this kind of examination.
I am paying for this microphone.
What difference does it make?
I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore!
I'm just a patsy.
Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war.
Wherever there's a cop beating up a guy, I'll be there.
We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. The rock was landed on us.
The United States is owned by foreign corporations. Do you really care? And if anybody cares, they're considered crazy.
I have sinned against you, my Lord.
Man, all the humanity and all the...
Controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
An unspeakable tragedy. Dead on arrival.
And I will go to my grave being at peace about it.
Our long national nightmare is over.
Don't give up. Don't ever give up.
This is the Midnight Rider News Show with S.T. Patrick.
Hi, this is Brad Schreiber. You're listening to the Midnight Rider News Show with S.T. Patrick.
Hello, America and the world. Welcome to the Midnight Rider News Show. I'm S.T. Patrick, your friendly neighborhood host, traipsing through the trials and travails that have so tempestuously and untruthfully been blasted into your eyes, ears, and minds by the state-sponsored talking heads, the court historians, and the textbook conglomerates that control information today. Tonight, we have episode 089, The Legacy of Charles Manson, with Nikolas Schreck. Our guest tonight is Nikolas Schreck, who's the author of the Manson File, Myth and Reality of an Outlaw Shaman, and the director of Charles Manson's Superstar. He'll join us next in the Midnight Hour. First, a little cleaning of the castle. Wow. Well, this has been a slow month for Midnight Rider News Show, as I'm sure you've noticed, but I promise you, I have not been lazy. We've actually been hard at work finalizing the editing of Deep Truth Journal Issue 1, and as of today, I can proudly say that it's all in the hands of the designer. It's off my computer. Well, it's still on my computer, but it's in his inbox. So he has everything, and this makes me feel confident because the designer has done some incredible work in the past, so I'm confident that he'll do the same here. Now, we're still looking at an early November release, and I'll absolutely keep you posted here, as well as on Twitter and LinkedIn LinkedIn, and I'll have Ann keep you posted on Facebook, so stay tuned for more. And again, for those who didn't hear the news before, we have some incredible writers lined up for issue 1 of this magazine. We have Lisa Peace, John Potash, Jim DiEugenio, Joseph Green, Donald Jeffries, Douglas Horn, William Davey, Richard Bartholomew, Carl Evans, Randy Benson, and Jim Hogan. Now, I've already read all the submissions, and this is going to be a magazine that you absolutely don't want to miss. I promise you that. So if you're the kind of person, like I am, who sort of relishes in an opportunity to challenge the historical establishment, then Deep Truth Journal will be for you. So again, stay tuned. Now, a little plug for everyone who's new to the show. We do have our free archives at MidnightWriterNews.com, and that's writer with a T, MidnightWriterNews.com. And to all the fans and followers of Nikolas Schreck, thanks for listening, and we hope you'll peruse our archives as well. And the easiest way to hear us is to subscribe, again for free, on the Apple Podcast app, which is on every iPhone, or on any other podcatching app on the Android. So we are there. Thank you all. And we'll be right back with Nikolas Schreck.
Hi, this is Richard Jones of the Jack the Ripper Tour and the writer and producer of Unmasking Jack the Ripper. Download episode 27 of the Midnight Writer News Show and you will learn the truth about the Whitechapel murders that terrorized London's East End in 1888.
Nikolas Schreck is here from Berlin, Germany tonight, and that's about 7 hours ahead of your friendly neighborhood Midwesterner here in Illinois. And Nikolas was here to discuss Charles Manson and the Tate-Labianca murders last year, and that's episode 026 for those of you keeping score at home. And we titled that one, Charles Manson and the Myth of Helter Skelter. Now, I was a bit nervous about that one, as Nikolas and I went 3 hours, which is by far our longest show yet. And I wasn't sure how you'd really accept that, but you did. And it's been one of our top 5 most downloaded episodes almost since the day it was released. We're very happy about that. And it consistently does well every month. So people seem interested in this story, and they seem interested in Manson himself and in Nikolas Schreck's take on it. And they should be. Nikolas is the author of The Manson File, Myth and Reality of an Outlaw Shaman. And he's the director of Charles Manson Superstar. Now, I didn't know Nikolas personally before we did that show last year, and we've had a chance to really stay in contact, and I've really appreciated that. He's a very knowledgeable guy with a wide range of interests, and we'll say it many times tonight, but if you haven't heard our last show, episode 026, please listen to that one as well, because tonight we're going to go into detail on some of the legacy, some of the bigger picture stuff. But in that episode, Nikolas really laid out the details of the background and the crimes. It is a really sharp piece of work what he did that night. So I, for one, am glad to have him back. Nikolas, how are you this evening?
Hey there, ST. How are you doing?
I am well, and yes. It definitely doesn't feel like it's been that long.
Exactly. I was going to say, it doesn't feel like it's been a whole year, but it has, and a lot has changed since then.
Well, a lot has changed. You're certainly right. And as I said in the intro, that episode remains one of our most popular, and I really do have you to thank for that. So thank you very much, Nikolas. But it also seems like, I think that's a good sign, both for this story and for your work, that people have really been open about the Manson story.
I have noticed that it has actually gotten through to a lot of people who were perhaps not even familiar with even the superficial mysteries of the case, and that it has made a difference, and I've gotten a very positive reaction to it as well. So we will go deeper down the rabbit hole tonight.
Well, Nikolas, you're the author of The Manson File, which you originally published in 1988, but so much has happened in the past 30 years.
Right.
Now, I know you've been working on an update to The Manson File. We talk about it quite often because I want to read it. So when will that be out? What's the status?
Yeah, well, the original Manson File that was published in 1988, as I explained in the first episode of our interview last year, but maybe I should put it in context for new listeners who didn't hear that. That happened because of a book in 1987 called Manson in His Own Words by Newell Emmons, who was a ex-con who had done time with Charles and who then knew him out on the streets in Hollywood when he was a hoodlum in the late 50s and early 60s. And Newell Emmons had published with Grove Press a book called Manson in His Own Words, which purported to be a memoir or autobiography by Charles, but in fact it was not. Emmons went and interviewed Charlie at Vacaville prison, and he sort of paraphrased what he said and mixed it with a lot of other erroneous material, and Grove Press very much screwed up the flow and of what the book was intended to be. And to make a long story short, Charlie was very angry at the ultimate result, a very complicated reaction to the book, which I could explain, but in essence, he felt that it had totally misrepresented him. He was angry about a lot of things that he told Newell Emmons in confidence that Emmons revealed in the book, and so their bad blood developed between them. And this was about 2 years after I got to know Charles, and as a reaction to that book, Charlie said to me, basically, well, you're a writer, can't you make a kind of antidote to this? Can't you make a book that is really Manson in his own words? And I had already begun assembling some of his philosophical statements and sayings into a kind of pamphlet, which he had seen, and based on that little kernel, which eventually became the philosophy section of the first edition of the Manson File, and it's also in the 2011 edition, that became the foundation for what became the Manson File, and Charlie gave me permission to print writings of his that had never seen before, put me in touch with other people, and then I was contacted by a publisher when this project was already being put together in Information, and the publisher had a similar idea for a book that was going to be called the Manson Apocrypha. And what happened is instead I renamed that project the Manson File, which a lot of people don't realize was a pun for the Manson File, P-H-I-L-E, which was what I was getting at. And at that time in 1988, very little was really known about what Manson really believed or what his philosophy really was or his music. Now, because of the internet, it is much more widely understood and generally known. But in those days, everyone had a very limited perspective on who and what he was. So the Manson File was rather quickly put together in 1987 with Charlie's begrudging supervision and help and putting me in touch with people. And strangely, even Newell Emmons, the very guy who Manson was angry at about the other book, he helped me a lot. He gave me a lot of original photographs of Charlie and other material. So that was how the first Manson File came about. And it was widely available in mainstream bookstores when there used to be real bookstores and not just Amazon. It was promoted on mainstream television, and it made a big difference in the way that Manson was perceived. It was probably the first thing that trickled into the mainstream that even suggested there was an alternative to the myth of Manson that had been promulgated by the mass media and the court for so many decades. Now that was, 19 years after the crimes. So, but even by then, the myth was pretty huge and impenetrable and very difficult to get some light through all of the darkness that had spread. In 2011, the Manson File, Myth and Reality of an Outlaw Shaman, was published first by a French publisher who had commissioned me to write the book, and then in an English edition. And that, compared to the first edition, was a gigantic revision and an expansion of everything that I had learned about the case in the past decades, from 1988 to 2008, which is when I started writing the book. I completed it in 2009, and it was published in 2011. Now, since 2011, what happened was Charles had also contributed greatly and gave me many interviews for the new version of the book, the 2011 edition. But towards the end of the production process of the book, he was very temperamental and had a paranoid streak, a mile wide, even as well as we knew each other. he got the impression when the book was about to come out, probably from other people in his circle who were telling him this, oh, Schreck's going to say you're a federal agent and you were a narc. And that's what this book he's doing is about. Then he became very mistrustful. And I told him, Charlie, that's absolutely not true. You'll see the book. I sent him the book when it was published, and then he liked it a lot. And he was surprised. He realized that this idea that it was going to be that he was a federal agent or somehow working as a government informant or something like that was not in any way a theme of the book. So on the contrary, then he was very enthusiastic about it, to the point of sending people the ISBN number for it, encouraging them to get it, encouraging other prisoners to let people know about it. He even put an advertisement for it on his official business card. So he became a very enthusiastic advocate of the book, which is rare for him because he usually despised anything that was written about him. Now, because he liked the book after finally reading it, he then said, well, you pretty much got it as close to the truth as anybody has, but there's a lot of things that I could correct and a lot of extra things I could tell you and anecdotes about many different dimensions of it, things about his connections to the musical world of Los Angeles, a lot of corrections, additions, and revisions that he then very generously spoke to me about in great detail. And we went through the 2011 edition, and of course I'm thinking, well, Charlie, why didn't you do this the first time? But, in a way I can understand. His trust issues were always great. So then he helped me correct and revise and expand the book, and that process took several years. So the first edition, which is now out of print, is being revised and expanded to this final edition, which unfortunately will become sort of a memorial edition, because just as I was finished with the revision, Charles passed in November of last year. And then to get to your second question, why has it been delayed since then? We can get into that a bit later.
Well, if I'm correct, I think the last version topped out at over 1,000 pages. It's a pretty long work, correct?
Correct, right. And because it was so lengthy, I had to decide in this new edition, for instance, to take out I had a very detailed, the first time this has ever been printed, a discography of every album, CD, and cassette that's ever been released of Charles' music, because the general public has generally just thought of that as a kind of footnote or curiosity to this saga, where in fact his music is central to who and what he was. So I'm going to make that discography available online, but I'm removing it because there was so much extra information that I had to place into the new edition. I had to remove some of the material from the other edition.
Well, I definitely want to know when it's going to be out, so keep us updated. I want to know the exact date so we can put it on the website, midnightridernews.com, and because, frankly, I want to buy one so that I can read it ASAP.
Out of gratitude for your support for my work, of course, you'll be one of the first to get one. Now, your second part of your question was why the delay?
Well, yes, because as we know, Charles Manson died on November 19th of last year, 2017, and maybe no surprise to some, the story became immediately contentious, especially in regard to his remains and the estate. And I'm sure there's great monetary value to the use of his likeness, for example, and, as you've discussed earlier, to all the music recordings and all of that. So out of the woodwork came multiple people claiming that they were entitled to the remains and the estate. So what really happened there?
Right. Well, it's a very long story, and it's actually almost like the story itself is a perfect symbol for the American tendency to turn death into a media event and the commercialization of somebody's life. And it's very symptomatic of our reality TV universe that we live in now. So one of the reasons the book publication of this new edition has been delayed is because I have researched what went on with the court battle, the funeral, and the subsequent consequences of the funeral in as much detail as I investigated the murders of 1969. So I've had to do, serious investigation to figure out what exactly happened, because it is a very puzzling and grotesque tale, almost a nightmarish tale of desecration of Charles is what actually happened. So I won't tell the whole story because it will be in the book, but in essence, the minute Charles passed, there had been a documentary called Sins of the Fathers that had contacted me a few months prior to Charles' death. And they contacted me to ask if I would encourage Charles to place a gentleman named Jason Freeman on Charles's visiting list, if I would try to convince Charles to allow this Jason Freeman to visit him. Now, nobody could persuade Charles Manson to do anything he didn't want to do. And Jason Freeman claims to be, on rather tenuous proof, to be Charles's grandson. And he has presented himself as such. And he had been in touch with Charles by telephone for quite some time. And he had become involved with this making of this reality TV show called Sins of the Fathers that was going to explore, supposedly in his words, Jason Freeman's path or stage or journey to coming to terms with the Manson stigma. That was the way it was presented. So I knew that Charles had no interest in seeing this person. He had been very disparaging of him and had dismissed him as somebody riding his coattails, as he had many other pretenders to the throne and people who had claimed to be relatives who had contacted him over the decades. So I told this producer from the documentary Sins of the Fathers, his name is Robin Keats, no, I won't participate in that at all. Just politely but firmly. And I thought that would be the end of it. Now, that was the only time I really ever thought about Jason Freeman or the whole incident. I was dimly aware from Charles and some of the people who he knew that there was this claimant to be a grandson that was in touch with Charlie, but it was not of great importance to me. When Charlie died on November 19th of last year, 2017, Jason Freeman suddenly was Johnny on the spot and appearing immediately to claim the remains of Charles and to make a claim for the estate of Charles, which are two courtroom procedures. So the first issue was who would be given the mortal remains of Charles. Freeman immediately appeared and did his best to be all over the media, proclaiming himself to be the rightful and only heir. And immediately red flags went off, because it was very clear to me from the beginning, after just doing the slightest bit of research, that what was really happening here was this reality TV show documentary, Sins of the Fathers, which had since been renamed Bloodlines, or Manson's Bloodlines. So what happened here, as I could see very clearly, was that this documentary TV show is really what this Jason Freeman's claim to the body and the estate was really all about. And I had known that, for instance, Freeman had gone with a film crew when Charles's illness had become known through the media and done this very melodramatic performance. He went to Corcoran State Prison, where Charles was, and put on this boo-hoo-hoo act, "Can't you let me in to see my grandfather?" which anyone who knows how California prisons work, or any prisons, you cannot just go to a prison and be let in if you're not on the visiting list and have you been approved by the inmate that you're visiting. So I already knew of this melodrama that had been performed for the benefits of a camera, and I knew that the documentary were very disappointed and frustrated that they never managed to film the scene that they really wanted to film, which would have been a heartwarming kumbaya hugging sequence of the long-lost grandson visiting Charlie. Well, they never got that because, one, Charlie never wanted that to happen. He never allowed him to visit him. Secondly, it was against California rules, probably because of Charles. You were no longer allowed to film a inmate in a one-on-one setting. So I knew immediately, because they didn't get that, which they needed, they've already invested in making this production, the next best thing, or maybe even better, is to film Charles Manson dead if they couldn't get him alive. And that is exactly what happened. Although Freeman never made any mention of this to the people that he convinced and, to my mind, basically bribed to help him in this ghoulish enterprise. So to make this very long story short, as I'll tell it in detail in my book, he was awarded by the Kern County Commissioner, after 4 months of Charles being kept in the Kern County Coroner's Office, which is in Bakersfield, where he died because he had been let out of the prison he was in, and he died in a hospital in Bakersfield. So his body was kept in Kern County. After this commissioner had awarded Jason Freeman, the claimant of being the grandson, the mortal remains, Freeman immediately went to work, and now he had promised the friends of Charles who he knew that, and he had even said this in the media, you can probably find it online very easily if you look at that time period, which was around March of this year. He had promised to do an immediate cremation and a dignified burial with no media. Now, what actually happened was, the second Freeman got to California and went to the morgue, a film crew from My Entertainment, which is the production company of this documentary production, Manson's Bloodline, were there to film the coroner's truck, to film the body bag that Charles was in, to film Charles's corpse being taken out, which by any normal standard of human decency and dignity is already outrageous. And it turned Charles' passage into a freak show, similar to, for instance, in the 1800s when every carnival in America had John Wilkes Booth's corpse to be seen for a nickel. That's the kind of exploitation that was going on here, this kind of carnival-like exploitation of a human being's death for entertainment. And that's the name of this production company, My Entertainment, which couldn't be more symbolic. So without the friends of Charles being aware of what Freeman was doing, he ordered that Charles's body, which had basically been rotting because it had been kept refrigerated rather than frozen for 4 months, he ordered it embalmed. Why? So that it could be filmed, because without a body to film, they had no documentary to film. So that's what he did, and it shocked the friends of Charles, the small group of people that Freeman managed to win to trust him. And without their knowledge, he had allowed the film crew to film Charles being unzipped from the body bag, filmed them cutting his hospital ID off of his wrist, and you can see his decaying arm. In other words, there could not be a more horrific intrusion on the privacy of someone's death. Now, in saying all this, I'm aware that to the average person on the street, especially in the USA, where this demonic myth of Charles Manson, evil incarnate, is so prevalent, people would think, well, he deserves that. Why should this mass murderer deserve any dignity? And I've heard all that, and I can imagine how people who are conditioned to social conventions about what Charles is supposed to be would react. But out of human decency that would be given to any other human being who's died, I think most ethical people would agree filming somebody's corpse for an entertainment show is about as low to the gutter as you can get. And that is what happened. And this funeral went on. It was basically a film shoot masquerading as a funeral, because in fact, this producer, Robin Leach, who I mentioned before, went on an interview a few months after the funeral and admitted that he had set up the whole funeral. So in other words, it was a production. He had his financing for this documentary, had paid for the funeral home, paid for the cremation, arranged it. The whole thing was fake. It was just a reality TV funeral, not a real funeral. And though some people who attended it, because what choice did they have? These were some friends of Charles who did decide to go to it, despite their revulsion at what was happening. They had to sign a video release to enter the complex where the funeral was held, and it was basically a TV show using Charles' corpse as a prop. Now, I think you know, and I'm sure lots of your listeners know, Charles Manson's relationship to the media was extremely complex, but the last thing he would have ever wanted is to have his body shown by a exploitative television production so that his enemies and the many people who hate him and his detractors could gloat at his death and his body being abused in this way and turned into a kind of circus attraction. So that's the gist of what happened. And then it actually gets worse, as I explain in my book, because without dwelling on the morbidity of all, what really happened here was, as soon as the cremation occurred after this funeral, this open casket funeral of somebody's rotting body, which had been embalmed and, displayed for the camera, after this happened, two things occurred. A photograph was leaked to TMZ, which your listeners in the United States will know is this trashy tabloid gossip internet site, and they were the first people who printed this image of Charles Manson's body in the open casket funeral. I don't know if you saw that.
I believe I saw the pictures, but maybe not with TMZ.
Yeah, so that's where that came from. So that was, I think, a day or so after the funeral that happened, and immediately Jason Freeman blamed one of the attendees for doing it, but as it turns out, it was actually the film crew who leaked the picture as part of their promotional gambit. So immediately, it goes from bad to worse, where this exploitative fake funeral is then leaked to the lowest kind of gossip internet site to entertain morons with Charles's death. And then after that, it got even exponentially worse, whereas Charles's ashes were starting to be distributed to murderabilia collectors, true crime collectors and aficionados, the kind of people that collect the autographs and memorabilia of murderers and serial killers, which is exactly what Charles did not the company he wanted to be in. So his own supposed grandson allowed one of his compatriots to give ashes, whether they were sold or given as part of some other roundabout deal still remains to be confirmed. But basically now Charles' ashes are all over the place in the collections of true crime collectors. So basically this funeral was the manufacture of a product to be sold. Charles's corpse was turned into ashes, and then even sleazier, Freeman also immediately, the day after the funeral, began selling the pamphlets from the funeral. The very day after the funeral, and he said, I'll sign these funeral pamphlets to make them more valuable. Then he sold parts of the blanket that was on Charles. He cut them into little pieces and sold them to some company called True Crime something, and sold these little pieces of the patches that way. So in other words, Charles' body was immediately transformed into a commodity, into something to sell. His death was made into a marketing ploy, and this kind of morbid ghoulish merchandising continues to this day in ways that I detail in the final chapter of the book.
Nikolas, I'd like to get back to the California courts for just 1 minute if we could, because I'm pretty surprised that Jason Freeman was able to actually win the rights to the body in the estate, because there were two other claimants who said that they had wills from Charles himself. Now, there was Michael Channels, who apparently corresponded with Charles, and he had a will from February 2002 that leaves both the body and the entirety of the estate to him. And then there was a Matthew Roberts, who alleged to be Manson's son, who also had a claim from January 2017, and that was a will possessed by a Ben Gorecki. So it seems like Freeman, with no DNA evidence of relation to Manson, should have been well behind the pack. And I know there are also other children, legitimate children. So how did Freeman win?
Well, that's a good question. Now, to be completely transparent, I will answer your question. What you didn't mention is that one of the contenders for the right to claim Charles' body and to hold a funeral or memorial service was Charles' actual biological son, Michael Brunner, who is known in the Manson legend as Pooh Bear and was actually christened Sunstone Hawk. And he was Charles' biological son, and he is the son of Mary Brunner, who was the very first of the women that began the nucleus of Charles' commune. And she was known in the group as Mother Mary. She almost became like the mother superior of the group. But she was the very first of the people who were drawn to Charles and what became this loose-linked commune. So just to make this very clear that I'm not objective about this whatsoever, nor pretending to be, Michael Brunner contacted me shortly in the middle of this process and expressed his dismay about what was obviously going to happen to his father's body, because he could see as easily as I could that this was all about showbiz exploitation and the selling of ashes and not in any way a dignified funeral for his father. So I sided with Michael Brunner completely, and I went as far as to write a formal legal statement suggesting to the court that Freeman, was not entitled, that Charles had no particular affection for him, and in fact that he did recognize Michael Brunner as his son. Unfortunately, because Michael was adopted by his grandparents during the whole chaos of the court trial when Mary Brunner moved back to Wisconsin, where she was born, Michael Brunner was adopted eventually by his grandparents. And according to California law, even though he is Charlie's biological son, that severs the rights in certain probation and estate matters. So he was then not, so on a technicality, the commissioner gave the rights to Freeman, because also these other two wills were not considered to be valid by the court. However, that's sort of mysterious, because even though Michael Brunner's attorney had presented many challenges to the commissioner of the court, saying, well, we don't even have DNA to prove that Jason Freeman is even a blood relative of Charles Manson, which to this day we do not have that. And he refuses to provide a DNA test to assuage the doubts of the many people who are very skeptical of his legitimacy. Basically, the court ignored all of Michael Brunner's attorney's challenges to Freeman's legitimacy, and I think just because they wanted to get this over with, they had no particular affection for Charles Manson, they just gave it to him without looking into it, and they really didn't consider the other wills, which may or may not be valid. Really, they didn't even take that seriously. It was done fairly quickly and without much procedural investigation into the entire matter. So really, by default, Freeman got the rights to this, and he basically used it to make a self-aggrandizing documentary about himself. It's not even about Charles Manson. It's about him and his very tenuous connection to Charlie, which is almost nothing. And the final thing I'll say about it, is that Jason Freeman had already, although he claims to be cursed by the stigma of Charles Manson, how this thing even began was that Freeman, several years before that, had appeared on... Are you familiar with the name Zach Baggins? Do you know that name?
I'm not, no.
Yeah. I don't keep in touch with American pop culture, but Zach Baggins is the host and producer of a number of trashy mass market TV programs about hauntings and ghosts and this kind of thing. A very low level of paranormal investigator, ghost hunter type thing. Jason Freeman had appeared on one of these goofy television programs with Zach Baggins, in which he talks about the curse of Charles Manson and removing it, and he's actually baptized on camera in this very melodramatic and almost laughable way that's clearly just for the cameras. And he, even more laughably, is confronted with what Zach Baggins claims is a haunted television that was in Charlie's cell. This was before Charles died. And that the television is haunted by Charles Manson's evil powers. This is how this whole documentary that led to a production company supervising and producing Charlie's funeral, how that even began. So that gives you some idea of the background of what occurred.
So for those out there who aren't quite getting why this is important, why it's important that Charles Manson's body and estate were treated this way, why don't we explain it to them right now? Why is this important, Nikolas?
Well, yes. Why is it important to the story of Charles Manson, other than what I admit is my personal disgust and dismay about it? Because whatever one may think of him, Charles was my friend, and he deserved the same respect in his passage that anybody does, and that was stolen from him out of somebody's selfish desire to be part of a television production, which I think is pretty loathsome. So I admit I'm not objective about it. But on a more transcendent level, what does it tell us about the life of Charles Manson and how this phenomenon fits in to American culture? Basically, it's important because from the beginning, especially in 1969, when Charles first became widely known because of the sensationalist coverage of his arrest and indictment as the supposed mastermind of what has been referred to as the Tate-Labianca murders, though that's a very simplistic way to describe them. From the very beginning, from 1969 until now, everything about this case has been seen through the distorted prism of the mass media. It has always been almost immediately transformed into some kind of morbid entertainment, and that was true from the very beginning. There's been a number of, even since our last interview a year ago, the whole concept of fake news and what that the media presents, what is truth, what is reality. If you look at this case from the beginning of its reportage in 1969, and I discussed this in the last episode that we did, immediately when Susan Atkins supposedly confessed to the crime, which was in fact a staged confession, which her lawyers prompted her to do, telling a fictional narrative to a planted informant, immediately that story was sold to the media by a gentleman named Laurence Schiller. And if people listen to our earlier episode together, they will find out who Laurence Schiller was, a very suspicious character indeed. Laurence Schiller, almost full circle, he immediately took the story of the case, sold it as a cheapy paperback to push the mainstream narrative of what the crimes were supposedly about to the mass media, sold it to foreign newspapers, and with a deal through the Los Angeles Times, which was made through Susan Atkins' lawyer, Paul Caruso, a mob-connected lawyer, basically sold the idea of Charles Manson is this evil mastermind, hypnotic guru who controlled these people and forced them to kill for him. This idea was already packaged as an entertainment as a book called The Killing of Sharon Tate, which Lawrence Schiller basically transcribed the tapes these lawyers provided and immediately was sold to the media. So Charles' case began as an artificial, contrived, the fakest of fake news, not anything to do with the truth of what happened. And of course, each step along the way that the media handled the case, the way that the media reported it, was never sober or objective. There was no real effort of any kind of investigative journalism to look into what really happened. It was just the marketing of this sensational horror story that, as we will explain later, had almost nothing to do with the facts of these crimes or of this person who was accused of the crimes. So, to put it in context, to look at this thing in depth, it began with this entertainment, fake, phony presentation, and then the main thing that people really had ever seen footage, if you've seen footage of the so-called Manson family, which is another media contrived name that they were never actually called when they existed, this film Manson from 1974 by Robert Hendrickson and Merrick was also staged. Basically, if you see this documentary footage, which you've seen a million times and was recently repurposed and repackaged on a Fox television program called the Inside the Manson Cult, The Lost Tapes, where they pretended that this footage was new, but actually they had just made newly developed copies from the negative. This material that shows the Manson family, the Manson commune, was staged and scripted by Hendrickson and Merrick to make them look scarier. For instance, the girls in the family, in quotes, were given guns, even though they had no experience with guns, and told to say these threatening, frightening things for the camera. So most of what the media has presented, and most of what the public knows about this case from the beginning, has been an artificial, staged performance. Then we go further to the actual trial. The Tate-Labianca trial, in which when Charles Manson was refused the right to defend himself, because that was originally what he appealed for, is to act as his own attorney. When he was refused that constitutional right to defend himself, he said to the judge, well, I will turn this court into a circus then. And then Charles put on this performance, basically mirroring the evil guru that they had created for him, this role that he'd played. And he, sort of like the Chicago 7 trial a year before, in 1968, Charles turned the trial almost into a performance art piece where he started to create this character that the public now knows, this Charlie Manson guru, hypnotic, evil monster. And much to his own detriment, he played that part so well in the trial, but he was performing. That is not the real person. He was very contrivedly putting on a performance. And the girls' performance, Susan Atkins, Leslie Van Houten, and Patricia Krenwenkel, we've seen this footage a million times of them singing and giggling and laughing and acting like Charlie's zombie followers. That was basically Paul Fitzgerald, and who was the supervisor of the very incompetent defense team for the defendants. The theory was that if the girls act in public for the camera, for the press, and for the jury, like they are completely under the control of Charlie, what the defense would have been, had there ever been a defense, which people don't realize there never was any defense. If there had been a defense, the girls were going to put it across, well, we didn't know what we were doing. We were under this evil man's control. And so they were performing. So the girls are performing as the enslaved zombies. Charles put on this very flamboyant performance. And Vincent Bugliosi, who we discussed in great detail in the previous episode we did together, also put on a performance of the heroic DA, the Van Helsing defeating the Count Dracula of Charles Manson. Why did he put on his performance was because he had his ghostwriter, Kurt Gentry, a hack ghostwriter who had written, many pulpy paperbacks before that, sitting in another room in the courtroom while Bugliosi was doing this grandstanding act and presenting what we now know was a totally false motive for the crime. While he was putting on this performance of the great super sleuth and DA who is defeating the devil incarnate, Kurt Gentry was already putting together the book that became Helter Skelter. So you have three different performances going on in this circus of a trial. You have a fake documentary called Manson, which has staged performances. You have the killing of Sharon Tate, which is a staged confession. And then throughout the years, most of Charles's appearances, especially during the 80s, the golden era of tabloid trash TV, when he was constantly being interviewed before he was no longer allowed to speak to the media, these were performances too, very, very deliberate and conscious performances. So it's almost brings us full circle that Charles's death is then not a real funeral, but a reality TV presentation and production of a funeral. And this is why it is so incredibly difficult for the general public to even get to the surface of what the reality of what this case and what this person was really all about, because all that the average person who has not bothered to take the time to look deeply into it would know is this kaleidoscopic media presentation that has gone on from 1969 till this day. Just a few weeks ago or a week ago, this most recent Fox TV documentary, which was filled with errors, almost completely wrong. From what I've gathered of people who saw it, I didn't see it yet because it wasn't broadcast in Europe yet, completely erroneous and distorting the story even more. So what's important above and beyond the fact that a human being should not be treated in such an undignified way and desecrated, no matter what you may think he's responsible for, what's important is the way that this case has always had this false, phony, performative, almost Hollywood production feel to it. And I think it's very important to understand the significance of how the media created this myth and how what people accept to this very day as fact about this case and about Charles Manson and about his commune and about the murders that they will eternally be connected to is largely a fiction created by television, by the press, and by the media. So that Charles ends up as a prop in a TV show is unfortunately fitting to the way that his whole life since 1969 upon his arrest, he became turned into a TV character. And as he himself said once, and I compared Bugliosi to Dr. Van Helsing and Bram Stoker's Dracula, once Charlie said of himself, "When I'm dead, people won't even realize I was a real person. They don't know that Dracula was a real person." He was referring to Vlad the Impaler, the prototype for Dracula. So he himself was conscious that he had been turned into a very unique media-created myth that had almost nothing to do with the real person. And before anyone who can even begin to look into the reality of this case, they have to understand how deep-seated this myth that's been created by the media is.
You're right, and I think part of it being a deep-seated myth, the Manson myth or the Bugliosi Helter-Skelter myth, whichever way one prefers to see it, is that this myth was spawned by the political climate in California. So we should go back to those years, 1969 and 1971, and look at California, which was a state helmed at the time by Ronald Reagan, who was the governor. But not only Reagan. Now, I think it's worth mentioning that Edwin Meese was Reagan's chief of staff, and Evel Younger was the attorney general. And the FBI's COINTELPRO operation was still wildly active in California as well, and we went into that in some detail with Brad Schreiber, who did Revolution's End, the Symbian Liberation Army book. So we're not going to go into too much of that now, but I do want to focus on the Reagan administration reaction. And I'm not really sure that we can discuss the genesis of this myth, the Bugliosi myth, without setting the political environment from which it came. So what impact did the Reagan administration have on the Manson story?
Well, yes, I agree with you. It's crucial for anyone looking into the whole Charles Manson phenomenon to place it in the historical context of 1968 and 1969 California, which is so completely different than the American culture that we live in now, or what California has become. I think there is a stereotype and a cliche, which is the problem with telling this whole story, is that so many stereotypes and cliches and received ideas obscure the reality of it. It's almost like automatic thinking. People assume, and especially right-wing populists and the neo-Republican movement of today looks back as California as if it's always been a hotbed of, the lunatic left, of progressivism, of, revolutionary fervor, and that kind of thing. That's the cliche, wouldn't you say, that most people think of California?
I think that's the conventional wisdom, yes.
Well, that's really completely untrue, because in the 60s, despite the counterculture having a great presence in California and largely being spawned in San Francisco, the fact is the hippie movement, which of course most hippies at first didn't call themselves hippies. Yet again, this is a media invention. San Francisco columnist, in fact, the same guy that invented the word beatnik, invented the name hippie just to describe a phenomenon that already existed in San Francisco. Despite the rising of this youthful so-called counterculture, California in the 60s was extremely conservative, run by the aerospace industry, the television and film industry, which, quite contrary to popular opinion, most of the people running that industry were extremely conservative and leaning more toward the right than the left. If I would quarrel even if left and right are even words that have any significance in American politics, because they're almost their own mutant version of these things that don't have much to do with the traditional definition of conservative, liberal, right, and left. But leaving that aside, at the time Charles was arrested, Ronald Reagan, a former actor, deeply enmeshed in the Hollywood film industry, whose career, as we now know, was very much pushed by MCA Universal, which was run by Lew Wasserman, extremely conservative supporter of Republican causes, who basically got Reagan into politics, and MCA Universal pushed Reagan to go to being from an actor in films to being an actor in the political arena. Basically, he was cast, just as he had been in his Hollywood productions. And again, this is the overlay of unreality to this whole case. You have a governor of California who's a B-movie actor performing the part of governor of California, which you later had again with Arnold Schwarzenegger. But in other words, this adds another layer to the Hollywood production unreality, the fictional nature of this whole thing. But having Ronald Reagan as the governor of California when Charles was arrested and when this first media wave of sensationalism began, that still is the dominant idea of what this case is about. Reagan was uniquely positioned because, as a scion of the Hollywood establishment, and since the 30s a part of the movie industry, all of his friends in the movie industry had to rely on him to protect their reputations, and we'll get into why that would be. But he was uniquely positioned to do this because Ronald Reagan had the mob connections, because through Lew Wasserman and Universal, he was connected to mafia control of the film industry, which was very prominent in 1969 and had been really since the 1920s. He was also going to protect his friends in the entertainment industry. And thirdly, as people may have forgotten now, Reagan largely won the governorship of California in 1966 because he basically ran against hippies. He ran as the anti-counterculture candidate who would put an end to campus dissidence and youthful rebellion and free love. And, so when Charles Manson appeared and was immediately transmogrified into the very poster boy for what a hippie is, even though, of course, born in 1934, he was not a hippie by any means, but he was transformed by the media, the way they reported it, into the essence of hippiedom. So that this happened during the Reagan administration, since Reagan's political goal and what he was communicating to his political base was, I'm going to wipe out the hippie movement. Charles was a gift to Ronald Reagan and his administration and to the Californian Republican Party, because now they could push the narrative that any counterculture or hippie or whatever word you want to use for this inchoate movement that had formed and that was relatively new at that time, now they could criminalize it totally. So any opposition to the Vietnam War, any communal living that breaks with traditional nuclear family values, any exploration of psychedelic drugs, any religious or mystical experience that is outside the confines of what middle America would consider acceptable Christian family values, and so on. Anything that challenged the so-called establishment of the time, the Reagan administration used the Manson case to push their political agenda. Now, Evell Younger was even more hands-on in this. Evell Younger, who was referred to even by his associates and friends as Evil Younger because of his manipulative and cunning manner, was, as you said, deeply enmeshed in COINTELPRO, which was J. Edgar Hoover's covert program, basically secret police program, to root out any kind of countercultural dissidents. Basically, these words are thrown around so much, but it was basically like Gestapo or KGB techniques in 1960s America to infiltrate and destroy any kind of dissidence to the Nixon administration in particular, but basically the power structure of America. Again, for Evell Younger, Charles Manson was a godsend, because having everything that he hated, everything that his agenda and J. Edgar Hoover wanted to destroy, communal living, free love, sexuality outside the boundaries of marriage, psychedelic drugs, that whole package, even the Beatles, everything that the so-called establishment hated about the hippie movement and the counterculture could now be laser pointed to Charles Manson and the evil Manson family, and so they could completely smear and repudiate any value and any revolutionary opportunity that the counterculture could have. And basically, another thing to remember about Evell Younger is that he had overseen the trial of Sirhan Sirhan for the assassination of Robert Kennedy, which was in a certain manner a dress rehearsal for what went on in the trial of Manson, in which Sirhan Sirhan, despite all the evidence, which of course we could wildly digress into that, was accused of being the sole person responsible for the murder of Robert F. Kennedy. Well, Evell Younger was supervising that in the same courtroom a year before. So I think that's very significant that Evel Younger, whose name has largely been forgotten these days, but with connections to the Central Intelligence Agency, a close friend of Richard Nixon, of J. Edgar Hoover, he, as far as I'm concerned, is who put together the scenario for the Manson trial and the way the Californian establishment dealt with this case as a way to totally defame and blacken the counterculture, using the media-created image of Charles rather than the reality to do so, if you understand where I'm going.
I do, and the image also made its way as high as the President of the United States, who at this time was Richard Nixon, and he actually commented on the case as it was underway, which was pretty unprecedented. So we're going to listen to that right now, but the audio, I'll be honest, isn't that good. So right after Nixon, you'll hear David Brinkley explain the situation.
They tend to glorify and to make heroes out of those who engage in criminal activities. This is not done intentionally by the press. It is not done intentionally by radio and television, I know. It is done perhaps because people want to read or see that kind of story. I noted, for example, the coverage of the Charles Manson case when I was in Los Angeles. Front page every day in the papers. It usually got a couple of minutes in the evening news. Here was a man who was guilty, directly or indirectly, of 8 murders without reason. Here was a man yet who, as far as the coverage was concerned, appeared to be rather a glamorous figure. A glamorous figure for the young people whom he had brought into his operations. And also, it was another thing that was noted was the fact that 2 lawyers in the case, 2 lawyers who were, as anyone who could read any of the stories could tell, who were guilty of the most outrageous, contemptuous action in the courtroom, and who were ordered to jail overnight with the judge, seemed to be more the oppressed, and the judge seemed to be the villain.
On his way back to Washington from San Clemente today, President Nixon stopped in Denver to talk to a meeting of law enforcement officials, and then he called a news conference where he charged the news media tend to glorify and to make heroes out of criminals. Reading from notes he had in his hand, he said, unless this glorification of those obstructing justice is stopped, the system will break down. And then the president made the flat statement that Charles Manson, who is on trial for his life in Los Angeles, is guilty, directly or indirectly, of 8 murders. A few minutes later, his press secretary called back and said he was retracting the president's statement because he had failed in referring to Manson, failed to use the word alleged. But by then, the trial in Los Angeles had been thrown into a small uproar.
So Nixon said Manson was guilty of 8 murders. Now, as David Brinkley said, he retracted it, but the retraction could not have had the same impact as the original statement, right?
Oh, absolutely. And this incident, which is really almost unprecedented in the history of the presidency, maybe until recently, but we won't even get into that, of having the President of the United States declare, and what he basically said, I'm paraphrasing, Nixon, who, let us recall, was a very competent lawyer himself and a very shrewd legal mind who knew the ins and outs of law completely, far more than many other presidents who have been lawyers. He was actually a very skilled and cunning attorney. For him to make the decision, which he well knew could well have led to a mistrial, for the President of the United States with the bully pulpit that the president has, to make this declaration it was a press conference held in Colorado for law enforcement officials, which is interesting, in which he stated that Charles Manson, directly or indirectly, is guilty of these murders that had happened in California. And he said this, just as the trial was getting underway. And there's many legal experts who have said, by any standard, that should have led to a mistrial. How can there possibly be a fair trial when the President of the United States with the authority that the president then had before Watergate and all of the general deterioration of that office since then, how could anyone possibly be considered to get a fair trial? So that is an astonishing historical anomaly. But what is not covered, and what very few historians have even looked into, and what in the mainstream media I don't believe it's been touched at all, is that Nixon himself, and let's put this again in context. You've got Ronald Reagan in charge of California. You've got Nixon in charge of the entire federal government. Also from California. Nixon, a native son of California, also with a great deal of support from the movie industry, and having every reason, again, to protect the Hollywood film industry, because they were big supporters of him, as they were of Reagan. You've got these two working hand in hand, but what has not been covered, even though, some histories of the Manson saga mention the Nixon saying that Manson is guilty incident, they don't really understand the deeper significance of it, because when the secretly recorded tapes in the Oval Office of Richard Milhouse Nixon have trickled out over the years, one of them that very few historians have paid much attention to is Nixon is talking to his cronies in the Oval Office after this incident, a while after, and you can find it online. It's very badly recorded, but you can hear it. Nixon actually says something to the effect, I'm paraphrasing, I knew exactly what I was doing with that Manson thing. Sometimes you got to try a court, or you got to try a trial in the press. And he refers to a mysterious they. They needed us to do that. So this remark makes it clear that Nixon calculatedly made the drastic decision to publicly declare Manson guilty at this Denver law enforcement gathering for an agenda, which I hesitate to speculate exactly what that agenda is, but that is pretty damning evidence, to use the Watergate language, a smoking gun. The President of the United States, why, fighting the Vietnam War and dealing with all the other pressures the Nixon administration was dealing with, would he not only make the statement Manson is guilty, which Charles tried to make into a mistrial by holding up the headline in the court, and again the judge decided no, there's no reason for a mistrial and continued the trial anyway. Why would he then even tell his political intimates, the people who were closest to him, that he calculatedly made this statement to make sure that Manson was convicted? It's very peculiar, and that's all you can say about it. We cannot know exactly who the they that Nixon was doing this for, but there's definitely, if you listen to this secretly recorded tape, which is widely available and has been transcribed, it makes it clear that Evel Younger, Nixon's close associate, and Reagan and Hoover and Nixon were working together to make sure that Manson was convicted. And why would this relatively obscure and insignificant person, Charles Manson, need to be convicted? There was plenty of evidence to convict the people who actually did the murder. Tex Watson, Patricia Krenwenkel, Susan Atkins, Leslie Van Houten, etc. There was plenty of evidence to convict those people for that particular murder. They had confessed to the murders. The question that remains a mystery, why did Charles Manson have to be painted as the mastermind of the murder, that the President of the United States would single him out in this very dramatic and clearly conscious fashion? It wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was a deliberate political move. And I think that is a vastly unexplored part of this case.
Oh, I would definitely agree with that. It absolutely sort of added to the legend, but it didn't take long before Manson was, as you said earlier, evil incarnate. But soon thereafter, it wasn't only the right that was using Manson as a caricature of what they had opposed. The left was pretty quick to paint him as this stereotypical example of the extreme right. He's the new Hitler, the Nazi, the racist who wants the race war to commence. All of those things. But this idea of using Manson as the epitome of evil... Now, Nikolas, there have been serial killers, literal mass murders that don't have attributions like the epitome of evil. Why did this one catch on almost immediately?
Exactly, yes. I think it's important to underscore what you said is exactly why it's, in fact, the name, you can't even use the name Charles Manson. It doesn't anymore, it isn't an appellative or a referral to a human being. The name Charles Manson just means evil madness, the devil incarnate. To just the very name Manson can't be thought of as a human being. It has been so demonized, you almost have to refer to him in some other way because, and this is why I subtitled the new version of the book, Myth and Reality of an Outlaw Shaman, because you cannot anymore separate the actual living human being that existed from this myth that, will endure forever. And that is one of the strangest aspects of this. This gets into almost supernatural archetype. Why did society in 1969 need there to be this Antichrist figure, which is so ridiculously exaggerated and, grotesquely magnified beyond the facts of what actually happened? As you said, there have been an infinite number of true mass murderers and serial killers who have done far more hideous things than even what Charles was convicted for doing. Let's say that it's true that Bugliosi was absolutely 100% right and Charles Manson ordered his followers, to put it in Bugliosi's language, to commit these murders. Well, how many gang leaders and mafia bosses have ordered their henchmen to kill other criminals? That's just daily criminal behavior. Al Capone is not considered evil incarnate. John Gotti is not considered evil incarnate. So let's say Bugliosi's legend was even true. It's very peculiar when you step back and think about it. Or if you take genuine serial killers, which is crazy that Charles, who did not kill the people who he's blamed for killing and was not even present during their murder, genuine serial killers, people like John Wayne Gacy or Jeffrey Dahmer, they are, in no way are considered to be evil incarnate or to be, the very essence of monstrosity to the way that Charles is. So as you say, why is that? It almost is a question that goes beyond rationality. It is that Manson became, in his own lifetime, this mythic figure, which he himself was as perplexed about and thought it was, in a blackly humorous way, absurd. He knew he was not the supernatural figure that he became, even though he was a mystic and he was a religious visionary. He was not this person that the media created and which the public apparently needed, this kind of Antichrist of the age of Aquarius that he became. So that's the first, Joseph Stalin, nobody says he's evil incarnate. Of course, the only person who is, and whose name is, right next to Charles always, is Hitler. Out of all the historical leaders, Hitler is the evil one. Stalin somehow is not quite on the level of metaphysical demonology, So this is a mystery of historical interpretation. So why did Manson become synonymous with evil? And as you said, part of it is political, in that the Reagan-Nixon younger troika pushed Manson as and the media that were very compliant for the most part with the agenda, because basically people were waiting to destroy the hippie movement in some way. I think there's an illusion that there was a lot of utopian support for the hippie movement. And part of an answer to your question is this cliche and stereotype that you always hear whenever hack writers or documentary producers or news journalists speak about the Manson case. One of the things you always hear is that he killed the 60s, that the Tate-Labianca murders were the bloody end of flower power. Well, this is putting the cart before the horse. Really, these murders had nothing to do with the counterculture or the hippie movement in any way. They were just squalid drug deal that went wrong, and it really had nothing to do with the hippie movement per se. But the government at the time, the Nixon administration, the Reagan administration, and the compliant media, who was really just waiting to put the knife into the already failing counterculture, were all too willing to demonize it using Manson. So that's part of it, is the, quote, right-wing demonization of Manson as the epitome of everything the right wing supposedly hates. The irony, as you touched on, is that for the most part, Charles Manson himself, if you really listen to his viewpoint, I think most people would consider him to have ideas that are leaning to the right and not to the left, even though they were much more complicated than could be placed in any dualistic ideology. So then you have, not only was Charles Manson the incarnate of evil for the right, and when he died, you saw the right-wing media in America again use him as a way to kick the 60s and to condemn the drug culture and free sex and communes and the supposed liberal values of the 60s, as if Charles Manson epitomized it. So he became a scarecrow for the right of the hippie movement, and therefore was escalated to this demonic grandeur. And at the same time, the left see him as, these days, you know, in the context of our current political situation, after his death, he was then condemned as the pioneer of the alt-right and a Nazi and a white supremacist. So there's hardly a figure in history that is equally condemned by left and right. And of course you have people on the alt-right who despise Manson, even though you have some supporters also, and you have people on the left who bizarrely consider him to be a pioneer. I saw in one obituary of being like the first Antifa fighter, which is a bizarre misinterpretation. So he is just like a catalyst for hatred of both ideologies. And in fact, he transcended both, and as Lynette Fromme, probably his most articulate supporter and devotee, had said about him, you know, a bird needs a left and a right wing to fly. And that is how Charles saw himself, as neither right nor left. But a big part of the demonology of Charles, of making him evil incarnate, was the way the right wing and the left wing, or people that define themselves in such limited categories, projected everything they considered to be evil onto him. So to the right wing in California at that time, he was some kind of Che Guevara revolutionary, and to the left wing, he was a hippie Hitler. Now, nobody can be both of those. What was he really is almost completely hidden under this, you know, very grandiose fantasy, this demonic being that could be the devil for whatever you want the devil to be.
Well, right, and whatever each side wanted to hate, they made Charles Manson that thing. But I can't really say that he didn't earn some of that. In our last episode, you meticulously described a lot of the details that we hadn't known before, and there's a truthful story to be told about what really happened in that canyon. But if Charlie truly wanted to get that story out, the best way to do so may not have been to put a swastika on his forehead, stick out his tongue, and recite an anti-government diatribe. And And granted, yes, some of what he had to say about the government especially was pretty sharp commentary. But it seems like he had absolutely no discernment at some point. So was there ever really a time when you said directly, Charlie, you're never going to get your story out if you keep doing it this way?
Yes, many times. Well, I have to answer that question by saying ultimately, although he paid lip service to the idea of even when he asked me to put together what became the first Manson File, it was ostensibly to get the truth about who he is out there. And something I said to him early on, after the first Manson File came out, was as long as people see you as the mastermind of a death cult that ordered the murder of a pregnant woman, nobody is going to listen to your ideas or your music or your philosophy or consider you to have anything valid to say, no matter how wise what you may say about, his ecological views and his philosophy of outlaw. No matter how many people would agree with them, they're always going to be seen through the obscuration of he is this evil mass murderer who, as far as most people know, he personally killed Sharon Tate. And, you know all the rumors and myths and legends that have grown about that. And I would say to him later in life, before he would go to his parole hearings, I would say, why don't you just not do the act this time? Because it's probably hard for people who are listening to this to understand or imagine. The person I knew was not that character he played in most of his interviews. Some of them you see and you get an idea of a human being under there, but he, as soon as the camera was on, very often, he immediately went into this Manson performance art character he had created in court. And he enjoyed doing that, and he had his reasons for doing it. But of course, as it had in court, it completely obstructed the ability of most people to get any idea of what he really stood for, let alone, as you said, what the actual facts of this case that he spent the rest of his life in prison about. I don't think he really, even though he said he did, it seemed to me after knowing him for 33 years, when it really came down to it, he had many opportunities at his parole hearings, of course, in all of these television interviews, in my own interviews with him. He could have written to any number of journalists and said, here is exactly what happened. He could have, at his parole hearings, calmly explained there was no such philosophy as helter-skelter. It wasn't about Beatles records. This is what happened. He clearly had the opportunity to do that. And as he always said to me and to others, it would be very easy to explain what happened if we only had the opportunity to do so, if we only had the chance, if we had only been able to put on a defense at the trial. But in fact, he had the media's ear constantly, and he spoke in riddles, he spoke in enigmas. If you put together all of his interviews together, you can form an idea of what he's referring to in a very veiled and cryptic manner, but he had every opportunity to say this is the truth. So for some reason, and we can speculate about why, some of the things he said to explain it, I can get into, but obviously his provocative manner, using the swastika on his head, for most socially conventional people, immediately placed him beyond the pale of someone you even want to hear what they have to say. Now, he deliberately did that. He had said, you asked why did he do that? Maybe we can get into that a bit. He had met I believe, Eskimo American Indian prisoner many years before that, who was called Lives on the Top. And this American Indian prisoner had explained to him the spiritual significance of the swastika in Native American mythology and metaphysics. And Charles then always had a fascination with that symbol. But one of his many explanations for it, first of all, the X that he placed on his head during the trial, which he famously said was to X him out of this world, out of this society, because he had seen that he was now a complete outcast. That has to be understood from his deep rooting in biblical thinking and the biblical saga. He saw that X on his head as the mark of Cain, which also, and this is rather obscure, but it is tied into Hermann Hesse's novel Demian, which refers to the mark of Cain in exactly these terms. So that X on Charles' head, which the women in the commune also copied when they were out on the sidewalk, was meant to be the stigma of the first murder, the mark of Cain. He explained later, when he turned the X into a swastika, that he said something to the effect, and I'm paraphrasing, I don't know the exact quote, but he basically said, if you want to get people's attention, you have to get their fear. And nothing is more a symbol of their fear than this. So by placing that there on the what is, in metaphysical systems known as the third eye, by taking that on, he saw that as a power, because he believed that fear is what awakened people, of what got people to pay attention. So that was one of his many explanations for why he used the swastika. And also as a self-identification, like the mutation of the X for the mark of Cain, the stigma of the first murder of Cain killing Abel, which pushed him beyond the pale of society, the swastika he deliberately chose as a way of saying, I am completely beyond what is acceptable, of a willful initiatory taking on of this pariah role that the swastika brought to him.
Well, Nikolas, you knew Charles Manson personally, so take us through this if you would. Approximately how many hours over how many years did you spend with him?
Well, I knew him for 33 years, from the end of 1985, and then when he went into the hospital, it was in 2015 or something like that. Then it became rather difficult to communicate with him, but there were on and off periods where we didn't communicate very much at all, which I can explain. But from 1985 until I moved to Austria in 1990, I spoke to him constantly. And when he wasn't in solitary confinement, then I was able to visit him, usually through, at that time in San Quentin, through the, when you visit someone with the glass. And then the documentary Charles Manson Superstar was a whole other thing, which required all kinds of red tape to get permission to do that. And then when I left America, he was not able to call anymore, but he wrote frequently. And then when I moved back to America, we continued to speak and also had communications. And then when I moved back to Germany, by that time, telephone technology allowed for him to make illegal phone calls, which your California prisoner is not allowed to call overseas. So third-party friends of Charles, mutual friends of mine and Charles, would call him, or he would call from the prison, and they would transfer the call as a third-party conversation, which was illegal. And then, even more helpful, and this was of great importance to finishing the last and this final version of the Manson File, was that he was able to get access to smuggled cell phones. And when he was able to speak on the cell phone, he could speak without guards hearing him, really with only maybe the prisoner in the cell next door hearing him. And that was a totally other person than the person who spoke on the official phone calls, which are listened to by the guards and by the prison staff. So a lot of the information he was able to give me for this most recent edition and for the last one was communicated in cell phone calls. And the only time I visited California in this century, and I visited him in 2011, during the month I was there, he was calling me constantly on his cell phone to mine, and he was able to speak very privately and openly about matters he usually didn't speak of, because you have to remember that in prison you almost never are allowed to speak alone. You've got guards there constantly, you've got other prisoners, and when he would speak on, there was a telephone, a payphone in the hallway near his cell in his unit. When he talked that way, he could be very intimate and personal, but he was always very conscious that other people were listening, and he very often sometimes fell into the Charles Manson act, which he put on for other prisoners and for the guards. So that was, and then I can't even tell you how many phone calls there had been and how many letters, because not only was I his personal friend to the degree that one can be a friend with someone who is under such restricted conditions. It was almost like knowing a wild animal in the zoo. I mean, the conditions that made it difficult for him to communicate without censorship were very prohibitive. But I also helped him and worked with him, like, for instance, when he had media requests, he would ask me to deal with the production companies and vet them. And so I got to know his inner workings and what made him think and what made him tick, and then working on the 2 versions of the Manson File with him, doing the interview with him, I got to see different aspects of him. And I think another important factor is that when you knew Charles, he was very much, even though he was a solitary person, kind of like his commune, if you knew Charles, you had to know everybody else he knew, or many people he knew. So over these 33 years of knowing him, he introduced me to many people, some of them who have never attained any public acknowledgement or awareness, and I got to know what he was really like through various periods of his life by communicating with his relatives, other criminals, other convicts who he knew. I can tell you one anecdote of how Charles sometimes communicated information to me and to other of his correspondents and friends without snitching and without breaking his own personal code of revealing things in the underworld that should not be revealed to the overworld. Very briefly, he introduced me to an ex-convict who had just got out of prison with him in San Quentin, and he told me to go meet this guy in San Francisco. So I went there at the appointed place, and this convict told me that Charles wanted to communicate something to me, but he couldn't tell me over the phone or in a letter. So and this was very early on in my knowing Charles, and this person told me a great deal about the nature of what the crimes, not what they were about at that time, but the chronology of how the murders went down. That was quite dramatically different than what you have heard in Helter Skelter or what the defendants have spoken about in the courtroom and in their parole hearings. He revealed a totally different narrative of the chronology of the murders that Charles had told him. And so this convict told me what Charlie told him. A few weeks after that, I spoke to Charlie on the phone, and I said, okay, well, I talked to, let's call him, Mr. A. I talked to Mr. A like you told me to. And Charles says, I don't know who you're talking about. Who's that? And I said, come on, you know who I mean. And he pretended from then on, I don't know what you're talking about. So that gives you an insight of how he communicated, not only to me, but many other people I know, without, sub rosa. He sent this person to communicate information to me, but then he completely denied to me that it ever happened. So it was very... And then other times, strangely, on the cell phone in my most recent and last visit with him, I was in Venice Beach, California, where he had been very often. And in a cell phone conversation, he revealed very telling information about the night of the Tate-Labianca murders, for some reason, very openly. And I imagine it was because neither guards nor prisoners were listening, because it was a smuggled cell phone conversation. He actually led me to places that he was in Venice Beach that night. So when he had the chance to speak freely, he could. And I think for people that didn't know him, the main thing I can say is there were many different layers to his persona, and you never knew which Charlie you would get. There were many sides to his persona and his personality. But underneath it all, there was a very keen awareness of who was pulling the strings of all the various Manson masks that one communicated with.
Well, about those layers, you talked to him quite a bit, so you had many conversations over many hours. And apart from the case, I'd like to know what he was like. Who did he listen to musically? What did he read? What topics interest him? What kinds of things did Charles Manson like to discuss with you?
To be completely honest, the most conversations that we had, when we began our communications in late 1985, almost what we talked about exclusively was music, not particular musical artists, but the actual spiritual meaning of sound, of making music. And I approached him at first just as a fellow musician, and that was our initial rapport, was based on a similar idea of music having a transcendent and mystical value. Secondly, really, the thing that I would say he talked to me a great deal about was sex and everything to do with sexuality that you can imagine. A third thing that comes to mind is military history of every kind, of going back to ancient history. His awareness of military history and military operations and military thinking was encyclopedic. So we discussed famous battles, generals, military history going back from ancient times to modern times. His knowledge of the underworld, of the entire history of crime, is something we I mean, when I wasn't interviewing him for the film or the various books, we had very completely ordinary conversations about things that were going on in our lives. It wasn't like every single conversation was some amazing revelation, but these were the topics that he was concerned with. Of course, ecology and Ottawa and the preservation of the environment, his association with the animals, our mutual deep connection to wolves, for instance. He talked a great deal about Death Valley, where I had also gone. He would tell anecdotes from all areas of his existence, things that most people would never imagine that he'd experienced. He talked a great deal about his experiences in Mexico City and in Acapulco, which seemed to him to be a very happy time, something he returned to very often. And he talked about his spiritual awareness, everything from astral projection, consciousness experiences that he had in prison, and his ideas about religion and mysticism and visionary states, talking in tongues. I would say, just off the top of my head, those are the basic issues. But his awareness of crime, not in a strange way, even though he was a criminal, he could have written a history of crime. For instance, we would discuss the Tongs and the Triad, these Chinese crime associations, which he knew all about them and their structure, about the Thuggees, Indian worshippers of Kali that are religiously sponsored thieves and murderers. So he had his interest in mysticism, as I've said in the book, his interest in the underworld of crime and the underworld of magic and mysticism were interwoven. And then his main theme, I would say, that he returned to again and again was the nature of reality and the nature of mind. What is consciousness? What is mind? And what is this illusion of reality that we're in? And finally, I would think, and this is something he often credited to Alvin Karpis, the 30s legendary criminal that he was in prison with for a while, social awareness. He was very much of a critic of politics, and he read the Los Angeles Times every morning and often would send clippings from it. Very pragmatic and practical comments about the economy, politics, foreign policy. And I think also he was very much of an American patriot, which I think would surprise people. He believed that from the days of Washington to Lincoln, he emulated that vision of America and believed that after Lincoln, it had become a dictatorship and a federal authoritarian state rather than so he spoke very often about a sort of utopian idea of how America had lost its original vision of freedom. Those are some of the things that strike me the most. But often he told jokes and was very lewd and had a very scabrous sense of humor. I mean, people probably don't think of Charles Manson the comedian, but he was his basic attitude towards life was humorous. And also I have to say he was also incredibly temperamental, volatile. We had many arguments, as one does in any real friendship. We disagreed on many things, and we had periods where we really didn't get along very well at all, and then we would start over again, and whatever these issues were would be dropped. So I couldn't describe him without describing how temperamental he could be and how moody he could be.
Now, you mentioned his interest in sex and sexuality, and I would usually not venture into this territory on the show, but I think it's pertinent when we're talking about this era and the community from which Charlie and the girls both came. So I think this is a valid question. Now, on the last episode we did, I asked you which of the girls he liked the most, meaning which he liked personally, as a friend, as a human being. But with whom did he feel the strongest sexual bond?
Yes, he as I said, he talked very graphically about everything to do with eroticism and sexuality all the time. To me, anyway, that was a very consistent topic he brought up, not only in the 1967 to 1969 period, but in general. But I think I mentioned this in the last show, but absolutely, without a doubt, there was the one woman in his life that I would say he had nothing negative ever to say about. And one thing, anyone that knew Charles, really, no matter how much he liked someone, eventually he would badmouth them or have something, very insulting to say about everybody and anybody he ever knew. That's without exception. But the only person he spoke of without any criticism that I ever encountered was Lynette Fromme, Red. So in a way, he almost spoke of her as a wife. He called her his old lady. So despite his, idea of what one article about him called a group marriage, I would say that, to answer your question, that it was Lynette, according to what he told me. And he presented many different sagas and stories and epics to other people. Maybe what he presented to me was not what he presented to others. But to me, Lynette could be called a soulmate for him.
Well, that's interesting, because you did say last time that Lynette Fromme was was the one that he liked most personally as well. So that's interesting. And when you did finally talk to him about the case, or when you did periodically talk to him about the case, was there something about it, some point about how it all happened, that bothered him the most until the end?
Yes, absolutely. I think before I can answer that question, I have to put this in context as well. When I first started communicating with him, I knew from dealings with other prisoners, the last thing you want to talk about to a prisoner is why they're in prison. I mean, that's pretty much standard protocol. A prisoner wants distraction from the horrible conditions that they're in, and they don't usually want to talk about the reason they're there. So at first, because we talked about music or mysticism or ecology or sexuality or that kind of thing, I didn't ever specifically ask him about the crimes when we first got talking. And he would bring it up gradually and slowly as I got to know him better. And the consistent thread, to answer your question, because I didn't confront him or put him on the hot seat and say, okay, tell me what really happened. I never thought that was going to happen. His main thing that bugged him when he spoke to me was Danny DiCarlo, who was the treasurer of the Straight Satan's Biker Club. There was even more than Tex Watson, who you would think he would have every reason to be resentful to, since Watson blamed him for the crimes that he orchestrated and committed. The animosity that he had to Danny DiCarlo, who he would denigrate as that fucking rat. So I think that was very significant, is that most of his contempt of all these people who betrayed him and denounced him and accused him of hypnotizing them and turning them into murderers, he didn't have that kind of animosity to Tex Watson or Van Houten or the other girls, or Atkins, who basically was responsible perhaps the most, along with Linda Kasabian, for creating this legend of Manson, the hypnotizing orchestrator of murders. It tells you a lot that his main animosity for the 3 decades I knew him was always to Danny DiCarlo and certain Straight Satan gang members around him. And as you'll see in my book, that's because the Straight Satans were very deeply enmeshed in every aspect of these crimes, including, as he told me later in life, the Bernard Crow episode, the shooting of the black drug dealer Lotsapapa, which some of your listeners will know about, which is generally considered to be the instigating episode that set the whole bloody ball rolling. He said that originally, when he was going over there, Charles, to Lotsapapa's to deal with this drug deal that Tex Watson had committed, that he had asked Danny DiCarlo, the Straight Satan treasurer, to come with him because he was more experienced with guns and was probably more able and efficient at dealing with this kind of confrontation. And that means Danny DiCarlo knew about this incident, and Danny DiCarlo refused to go with Charles. So Charles asked another associate, a ranch hand at the Spahn Ranch named T.J. Wallerman, to go with him instead. The significant factor here, and why I mention it's important to your question, who of all these people what comes to mind as the main thread about the crimes, is because Danny DiCarlo knew that Charlie shot Lotsapapa, or Bernard Crow, DiCarlo held this over Charlie's head, and then after the Hinman crime, in which Charles had slashed the face of Gary Hinman before Bobby Beausoleil eventually murdered him, and that too, according to Charles, Danny DiCarlo and the Straight Satans were much more involved in that crime. Basically, DiCarlo was extorting Charles because he knew that if Charles, who was out on parole at that time, if the police learned that he was involved with this supposedly fatal shooting of Bernard Crowe, who actually, as it turned out, was not killed, and the Hinman cutting, that he would go right back to prison. So according to Charles, and I get much more into this in this final edition, these crimes that happened after that were very largely instigated by the need to pay extortion money to the Straight Satans because of DiCarlo and other bikers in that association who were extorting Charlie because of the information they had about the crimes. And that is a very significant factor that has not been explored in really most previous accounts of this. Danny DiCarlo is often pictured as a very minor and almost comical side issue to this whole episode. The most people know about him is, this humorous appellation that the girls called him, Donkey Dan, because of the size of his member. So he's been looked at as a kind of laughable drunk and, almost a figure of fun. But according to Charles, he very much was a major part of instigating these crimes and as I get into in the book, he had this minor involvement with the Crow incident. He basically pushed Bobby Beausoleil into the Hinman episode, and then, as I reveal in the book, was also very much a part of the Tate-Labianca murders and the Shorty Shea murder. So I think that it's much more than just answering your question. It's a whole other dimension to this case that has not been explored properly. And for people who may not be familiar with the case, Danny DiCarlo was one of the first persons on the Spahn Ranch who went to the authorities and snitched and basically started telling the story according to how he wanted the narrative to go of Manson ordering these murders. So DiCarlo went to the state and pointed the finger at Charles so that he could be relieved of charges against him, and he has disappeared completely off the face of the earth now. In fact, we don't even know if he's alive or dead, but that's a very significant factor, that Charles had this seething hatred of DiCarlo, even more than for all of the other people who had betrayed him, which was really a great deal of his supposed followers.
Yes, I can't even imagine what it would be like to be in prison for the remainder of your life, knowing that other people committed these murders, these heinous murders, for which you were psychologically blamed. And even if you believe that it's true, even if you believe that Charles Manson was somehow responsible, I still hardly think psychological coercion seems like a crime deserving of a life sentence. But when he was in, I can imagine that it was both better and worse for him simultaneously. On one hand, he's a target. He's Charles Manson. And I can't even begin to imagine how many times he saw himself on the prison television. That must have been awful. And on the other hand, he has throngs of admirers, and I'm sure his commissary account was always more than full, which probably made everyone else a little jealous. So did Charles Manson like being a star, even if it was for all the wrong reasons? And did he use that?
Yeah, I think honestly, absolutely. He, like a lot of, he was given this very strange anti-celebrity that he did not want. He would have, I can tell you, whatever he might have said, I don't believe he would have wanted to go down in history as the person who ordered the murder of a pregnant woman, which is what the average person who hasn't looked at this case, that is unfortunately what they will remember this person as. I think he was very unhappy that is what he became infamous for. He would have rather been known for his music, for his philosophical views, for his religious views, and most of all for his extolling of outlaw, air, tree, water, animals, his ecological system and platform. So, he was an entertainer. He often said, I'm not a rock star, I'm not an entertainer, but the Hollywood music industry recognized in him the makings of a rock star, and they were definitely trying to tailor him to become one, even though he was very willfully stubborn and unwilling to go along with the star-making machinery. He did certainly enjoy the limelight that he got. When he was given the opportunity to do these media interviews in the 80s, he complained about them and grumbled about the way they went. But of course, he could have said no. And like many other notorious figures, like Sirhan, who refused to give interviews, he could have maintained a dignified silence. But he had a love-hate relationship with his bizarre anti-stardom that he was given. I think he enjoyed the platform of being able to express his views to a certain degree, even though it was often distorted. And yeah, like everything with him, there was a degree of ambiguity. He often loved the same things he hated and hated the things he loved. So like many people who are propelled into public prominence, you form a love-hate relationship with it. There are positive aspects and there are very negative aspects. But as in the telephone conversation, which you'll be playing at the beginning of that call, I think ultimately what he said to me in that conversation, that his notoriety was ultimately a curse. I think that's what he really believed. And part of it, his willingness to talk to the media and that sort of thing, is on a very pragmatic level, it's very boring in prison. And very often he was in solitary. He was in the hole. So he told me quite honestly when I'd say, why are you going to do this interview with this idiotic journalist? You know it's going to be a negative hatchet job. Why are you going to do it? He would say, well, it gives me a chance to get out of the cell and move around and walk around. So you have to consider the pragmatic level of his life in prison. It was kind of a brief vacation from the usual same old, as prisoners call it, of the cell. So that's why he sometimes welcomed the same media intrusion that he also detested. So it's an ambiguous answer, but he was very, nothing was black and white with him. He hated it and he loved it.
So did having that many admirers and having that many admirers who would donate to the commissary account, did that make him a target?
Absolutely. And this is a very significant factor, which I did not deliberately and because he didn't want me to. And there's many things in the new edition of the Manson File that I'm only speaking about because they're no longer a survival issue for Charles. You're absolutely right. From the beginning of the bizarre notoriety that he gained from his involvement with the crimes and the kind of why I called my film Charles Manson Superstar, he became a kind of superstar. Not what he wanted to be, but he played the cards he was given, as he often said. Because of his celebrity, as you said, people would send him money, and he, being a self-admitted con man and manipulator, he would milk people for money by flattering them and making them believe they are the most, beloved of his disciples. Whatever they wanted to hear, he would very often play the games that he learned as a pimp and a hoodlum and a crook, which he, by his own admission, that's what he was. So he would milk people for money. He would tell them sob stories about why he needed money. And he got, hundreds of people since I knew him involved in various scams, which would be too detailed to describe here. And because he always had money being given to him by many, many different sources, the other prisoners, of course, as you pointed out, were extremely angry and jealous about that. Now, there's two aspects to this. Because he always had money, he was very generous to the other men in his unit and prison, and he would make sure, because he had extra money, he would give them gifts. He would buy things for them. He would have people he knew on the outside send quarterly packages to other prisoners. Part of this was out of genuine friendliness and generosity, and part of it was buying protection, because in the very delicate position he was in this high security unit, you have to remember that people who think he had a cushy life, he served very hard time. because every day he woke up with the awareness that someone would want to kill him because of this celebrity that he didn't ask for. Because he was such a high-profile prisoner, it would have made another prisoner's rep to say, I killed, the monster Charles Manson. So he lived in that kind of tension, and his generosity to other prisoners was partially genuine altruism and partially a way of protecting himself. The second aspect of what you're getting into is, and I didn't talk about this during his life, he was literally being extorted. As I mentioned with Danny DiCarlo on the Spahn Ranch, most people in that commune didn't realize he was being extorted by the straight Satans, and he didn't tell other people in the commune that, all but a very few. He presented himself as invincible, and nobody could get on his good side. But a lot of the prisoners were extorting him for years, especially in Corcoran State Prison. And as he got older and vulnerable, there were many threats of violence against him. And I'm not going to get into all the details here, but there were threats in which they'd say, we will kill you or harm you unless you give such and such amount of money to my wife, my friend, unless you send money here, unless you pay me this. And this led to a very ugly, vicious cycle of Charles needing to get money from any source to pay off or to ameliorate these threats. And they were very often death threats. And at one point, you can find online, he was beaten. He was punched in the eye by one of the prisoners that helped him to sometimes deal with his correspondence. So it was a very threatening and violent life for him. And as he became older and more vulnerable, it got worse. And there was a lot of what you would call elder abuse. If it wasn't the evil Charles Manson, he did not have an easy life because of exactly what you said, because of his celebrity and because you could only call them fans or groupies, and some genuine supporters would just give him money because it's Charles Manson. So that led to, it made his life more comfortable in prison, but it also led to a lot of threats of violence and outright extortion, which the guards turned a blind eye to. You could write a whole book about the corruption of Corcoran State Prison and how the guards took a cut or overlooked this kind of financial chicanery that was going on.
Oh, I have no doubt about that, and I would dare say that this is the case for almost every state prison in the nation. I know that I have some close ties to some prisons and some prisoners as sources, and I can tell you that the guards, for the most part, are as dirty as the inmates, and sometimes even more. But the interesting thing is that we've tried to do episodes on prison corruption and incarceration and the problem of punishment in America, but to be honest, I can't get anyone to listen to those episodes, and punishment is so ingrained here that it's sad. But I imagine that he also had a hard time due to his stature. What was his height and weight?
He was actually 5'7", and he always made a point of saying that the media wanted to keep making him smaller and smaller. In one interview, he was not 5'2", which is something that Bugliosi and his detractors, this is almost a part of the legend and the myth that he was this dwarf. And he was a slight person, and he was short by I guess average standards, but he was 5'7". He was not like this elfin dwarf that is often described. And in one of his interviews, he describes every time there's a new book or a new film, he becomes shorter and shorter until he's basically a midget. This was part of the general demonization of him, that he was a freak of some kind. And partly it was the jealousy of the DA and of the other people who created his myth, is how could this person that was sexually attractive to all these women, how to somehow emasculate him or make him diminutive and lesser. He's always described kind of like Roman Polanski, actually. It's kind of a mirror thing. They're always and Polanski has mentioned this too in his autobiography, always described as a dwarf or an elf or somehow a less, dehumanized because of their size. But, yes, he was small, but he was not, like a midget that you would get the impression from some of the derogatory descriptions of him.
And we're talking to Nikolas Schreck, the author of The Manson File, Myth and Reality of an Outlaw Shaman, and the director of Charles Manson's Superstar. Now, Nikolas, let's really address these Manson conspiracies, or as many of them as we can, in the time that we have. Now, there are so many, as you know, and the main one being that the Manson story was a CIA plot of some kind. And to be fair, there are some interesting ties, and there are some mysterious people and organizations that drift in and out of the story throughout. What they all mean, however, can be debated and discussed, and probably should be. Now, I know that you've gone into some of these, so what have you found?
I think to answer your question, the most important thing about that query is that in the past few years, I would say that the helter-skelter motive that Vincent Bugliosi put forth as the main reason behind these crimes that Charles was convicted for, and really even since Bugliosi's death in June of 2015, Bugliosi's reputation has definitely plummeted swiftly since his demise. And I notice, not on a gigantic level, but far more than ever happened before, that many, even pseudo-mainstream media reports are starting to question whether Bugliosi was telling the truth or whether the helter-skelter scenario really explains what these crimes were about. And the Manson File and a lot of my previous work has been concentrated a great deal necessarily on debunking Bugliosi's helter-skelter mythology that he created, let's keep in mind, not as a watertight narrative that would last the rest of time, but a prosecutor's way of convincing 12 jurors to put this man to death. That was the reason he created the helter-skelter scenario, partly to cover up the real motives for the crime, but also just to simply convince 12 other human beings to put this man to death. And helter-skelter was the prosecutor's method of doing that. It wasn't meant to last forever, and it hasn't, because it's got so many holes in it. Even people who are detractors of Charles are starting to wonder if that could really be all there was to these crimes. The more you look at it, it doesn't hold together. So the point is, when you say conspiracies about the Manson case, the fact is the helter-skelter motive was already part of what is genuinely a conspiracy to cover up what these crimes were about. So as the helter-skelter motive, as some people are slowly starting to become skeptical and doubt its veracity, and especially with the rise of the internet as humanity's main source of misinformation, because it's not the information highway, it's the disinformation highway, where every opinion is given the weight of fact. In the vacuum of people starting to doubt helter-skelter, even crazier and even more erroneous fantasies about what the crimes were about are starting to rise. And I deal with these in my book because in the past few years they have become so prevalent.
Now, Charles Manson was connected to celebrities such as the Beach Boys and Neil Young, to name a few. Espousing a hippie ethos that masked his twisted intentions, Manson and his family had a celebrity death list and earned their place in harrowing history with the Tate-Labianca murders. But was the cult leader just a puppet in a larger government organization? According to Charles August Schlund III, now deceased, he discovered top-secret files that linked the CIA to the Manson family murders. The CIA's motivation in all this? To disrupt the hippie movement that, in their eyes, had negative sociological ramifications to the country and would put an end to the Vietnam protest. Now, the CIA sought mind control. They experimented with drugs to achieve this goal, and MKUltra is their most infamous project. Before the murders that would make his name, Manson was in prison during the same time the CIA used inmates from Vacaville prison as test subjects. The drug testing allegedly continued with the Manson family, who also received the CIA's drugs according to these reports. Now, family member Tex Watson alleged in the months preceding the murders they were taking a drug called Orange Sunshine, which was manufactured exclusively by a group called the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. The dealer, Ronald Stark, had known connections to the CIA. The Manson prosecutor, Vincent Bugliosi, has studied in depth this case and is convinced that the Manson family was under some kind of mind control and compares Charles Manson's mind control techniques to that of the CIA, further supporting that there might have been a connection. In Bugliosi's words, to quote, "The Manson murders sounded the death knell for hippies and all they symbolically represented. Does the truth hide fiction or the fiction mask the truth? We'll never know, but we can trace the footsteps."
Well, as we just heard, there is still this idea that Manson killed the 60s, though I would argue that a much stronger case can be made for the May 1970 shootings at Kent State. I think that is probably a better symbolic into the 60s, to be honest with you, than the Manson story. And then there are the MK Ultra stories that link to his time at Vacaville, and even those who don't believe that he was necessarily involved with the agency have sort of implied that the drugs used at Spahn Ranch, for example, were CIA creations for the expressed intent and purpose of destroying the hippie movement itself. So I'll let you address those before we move further into the allegations.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that idea can be traced. I mean, basically the CIA, almost like Manson himself, is just used as this monstrous bugaboo responsible for all evil in the world, almost like the phrase Illuminati has become just a blanket buzzword to mean hidden conspiratorial elite. And I have researched the CIA a great deal as part of other research for other projects I'm working on. And I first of all have to answer the question by saying the CIA is not, it is certainly, like every intelligence agency, done horrible, unethical, murderous operations in the nature of its covert activities. But it is not a sinister secret society or some kind of a cult. It's not Spectre out of the James Bond universe. It's a group of failed, very often incompetent human beings, and they are not able, and they have never been able to pull off the kind of massive, perfect conspiracies that modern day conspiracy theorists ascribe to them. So I have to make that clear first. I don't think the CIA or any organization is that powerful to be able to get away with the kind of thing that they are often accused of. They sure would like to, but we know so much about their inner workings. For instance, MK Ultra, which gets into your question about what sort of LSD was used by the Manson commune, which is something that comes up a lot recently. So that's the first thing, is let's look at the CIA as a government bureaucracy, just as incompetent and fucked up as any other government bureaucracy, not a perfect criminal organization that can just operate with impunity, because they can't. So given that, I have never seen in all the years of investigating this the slightest even whisper of a proof that Charles himself was personally an agent of the Central Intelligence Agency. That said, and I mentioned this in a lecture that I gave in London in January that was called the Charles Manson Conspiracy, what I got into all of these issues. The very fact of something I mentioned earlier, that when I was working on the new edition of the Manson File, he was concerned that I was going to report that he had been a narcotics officer or a federal agent or somehow an informant. And I have never found any evidence of that whatsoever. And I've looked because of these rumors, and I've asked him directly about it. Knowing this particular human being, the real person, Charles Manson, I cannot imagine in 10 billion years him being an efficient target of an intelligence operation, or what possible use he would be to the Central Intelligence Agency. That's based on the personal relationship I had with him. I cannot believe it. And in all of the hundreds of anecdotes and stories he told me about very revealing things that certainly didn't put him in a good light, I don't believe it whatsoever. As someone who knew him for years, I see no indication of it at all. But the only thing that he himself created, and this is what I mentioned in my London lecture, why there seems to be smoke to this fire, he himself mysteriously referred very often to the fact that when he was let out of prison in 1967, March 21st, 1967, that he had said things a few times that he was on the never no mind list. Like that there were some sort of conditions. He has implied this in several discussions with other people and with me, and even in some public interviews, that they let him out and he should have been allowed to do whatever he wanted to do because they let him do that. And I know that's very damning to say, but I don't think the they he's referring to is the Central Intelligence Agency or any other agency. But I can't answer that question, but it is an intriguing peculiarity that he himself opened the door to this sort of speculation by implying, and he said in my interview that is in Charles Manson Superstar to the warden, he said many things like this. I did everything this guy told me to do. There was often a feeling and a statement he made of resentment against the authorities, like I did what I was supposed to do. And that is genuinely a mystery, and I think that's what led to a lot of this speculation, other than just the knee-jerk habit of conspiracy theorists to blame every single weird anomaly that occurs on the CIA, which that's just fiction. But there is that little bit of a degree of a grain of something. I don't know what he meant by that. But as far as any genuine connection to the CIA, I've never seen any proof of it. And I think that Mae Brussel, who I'm sure your listeners are aware of, is largely responsible for the idea that Tex Watson was some sort of CIA operative. And if we're going to debunk the helter-skelter myth, we also have to debunk the main way to answer this question is these murders were about Tex Watson and Linda Kasabian going to get revenge on another drug dealer, Wojtek Frykowski, and secondarily his semi-crime partner, Jay Sebring. When we know that is the reason for the most infamous of these murders, the crime that occurred at the Polanski house, then what possible reason would there be for the CIA to be involved with that? The only reason you can believe in this conspiracy theory is if you don't know what the crimes were actually about. Now, what Mae Brussel has been pushing, and then people like McGowan later, and then hundreds of other self-proclaimed internet experts and pundits about this case, what they have developed and embroidered around Mae Brussel's original idea is the idea, correct me if I'm wrong, I think this is the basic one, that the CIA deliberately set up the so-called Manson family to commit these crimes to discredit the hippie movement. Wouldn't you say that?
Well, yes, I think that's a pretty accurate description of the main conspiracies that I hear regarding Charles Manson. Well, at least that and the fact that Spahn Ranch, or the idea that Spahn Ranch had been infiltrated at some point.
Well, I have no doubt that there were police informants at the Spahn Ranch, and Charles very often, one thing he said at one point was, this will digress, but the murder of Shorty Shea, this ranch hand on the Spahn Ranch, who was generally believed to be the snitch that was not only trying to push the Manson commune off of the Spahn Ranch so that he could help his employer, a guy named Frank Retz, take over the ranch and get rid of these so-called filthy hippies. They also believed he was the snitch that led to this gigantic SWAT operation, police raid on the Spahn Ranch, which is a very mysterious incident that you could do a whole show about the bizarreness of that. Well, what Charles said, that he believed that Shorty Shea maybe wasn't as responsible for that ultimately as he had thought, and that again, that it was Danny DiCarlo who was some sort of law enforcement, either an informant or asset or working for them in some way. Other people have even speculated, and I have no proof for this, that Linda Kasabian, that her mysterious appearance and then vanishing, that she could have been an informant, or that she could have been somehow involved in some kind of law enforcement infiltration operation, and that she was even granted immunity and allowed to live the rest of her life as a free woman because perhaps she was working for at least local law enforcement. Whether that's true, I have never found any proof of it, but there's plenty of rumors and speculation about DiCarlo and Kasabian as possible informants. There's also the famous statement of Preston Guillory, which your listeners can easily look up, so I don't need to summarize it, that implied that the local Los Angeles law enforcement was letting Charlie get away with auto theft and drug dealing and underage girls and all of the felonies and crimes that were happening in his midst, because they were protecting him, supposedly because the Manson commune was going to help law enforcement fight Black Panthers and that sort of thing. That's another strand of the rumor. But most of this goes to Mae Brussel and people who are her disciples, and then people who may not even know where the idea came from, extrapolating on it, and this basic idea that either Tex was trained as a intelligence agency killer, not that the Tate-Labianca murders were set up particularly, as you said, but that they turned these hippies into killers using some kind of CIA mind control, that maybe Manson was either a puppet or a pawn for intelligence agencies. But all of these rumors and myths about CIA involvement I've seen, they all imply that there was a motive, that there was that the government wanted to destroy the hippie movement, and they used the so-called Manson family to do it. And I think that's absolutely ridiculous. That's an absurd case of what happened instead, as we explained in a more sober manner at the beginning of this interview, is the Nixon and Reagan administration certainly used the fact that an apparent hippie commune had committed these infamous murders. They used it, they pushed it, they exploited it to defame and discredit the counterculture. But I have seen absolutely no proof that any government agency was involved in any way training or setting up any of the people, including Charles Tex Watson, as CIA assassins. Secondarily, the question you mentioned of, was there something about the acid or LSD that the Manson commune used? Often it's ascribed to be orange sunshine, this particular brand of acid that was known to be distributed by the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, which certainly did have intelligence connections. And again, we could do a whole 10-hour show on the connections between the CIA, research into LSD, MK Ultra. But my answer, as someone who knew Charles for decades and has looked into this case in detail, and if it was true, I'd be the first to want to reveal it, I don't see any actual evidence of any connection between Central Intelligence or any other government agency and the Manson commune or any of the members of it.
What about the reported links between Charles Manson and the Process Church?
Well, that again is, in the true sense of the word, a conspiracy in this sense. I've looked into this in great detail, and because I was, as is well known, a practicing occultist. I've had involvement with most of the major occult and magical organizations at some point or the other, or I've met people who were involved with them. I have never found the slightest evidence that Charles was familiar with the Process Church of the Final Judgment. He denied it adamantly in Charles Manson Superstar. When I asked him about it, he said that's horseshit. I asked him again and again, was there anything to that? The most there has ever been is to Newell Emmons in that book I referred to earlier. He referred very vaguely in that book to meeting a group of people who believed in multiple devils at this spiral staircase house, which was a abandoned house in Topanga Canyon where the Manson commune crashed for a while. That is the only time Charles, and that's we're having to take Newell Emmons' word for it, that he even said that he in any way implied a connection. I never heard Charles refer to it, and when I met Charlie, I was deeply involved in devil worship and occultism. If there's anyone he would have an opportunity to speak to about the Process Church, it would be me. He didn't, and I've never heard him talk to anyone about it except to deny it completely. Now, why I say that, too, is a conspiracy. Lieutenant Earl Deemer, who was one of the homicide detectives on the Tate-Labianca crimes, looked into the Process connection detail very early on. What he concluded, and this is just a, ordinary Joe homicide detective, not an occult expert. He looked into these connections, which were brought up very early, even late 1969, early 1970, rumors about a connection to the Process Church of the Final Judgment were circulating in the press, in London and in California. What Deemer decided, and what he put in an official report, is that there was no connection to the Process Church of the Final Judgment, and this is why it's a conspiracy. L. Ron Hubbard and Mary Hubbard, his wife, with their ethics committee, which was the kind of secret police of the Scientology movement, they hated the Process Church of the Final Judgment because Robert and Mary de Grimston were what they called squirrels. They had abandoned the Church of Scientology and taken Scientological methods without the Church's permission and developed the process, which in fact the process is a Scientology term for a procedure that's used in Dianetics and Scientology training. Because the de Grimstons broke, the de Grimstons, for your listeners that may not know, were the leaders and founders of the process. They were ex-Scientologists. And what has now been proven is that Hubbard, as we now know from the many revelations about Scientology, would consider anyone who broke with his organization and used his trademarked and copyrighted techniques in their group, we would consider them fair game, to be smeared, to be criminalized, to be accused of anything possible. So we now know that Hubbard himself fingered the de Grimstons and the process, and because there were vague similarities between some things that Manson was said to have said about being the devil and Jesus, and some parallels with Robert de Grimston's philosophy, Hubbard used that opportunity, sort of like the Republican Party and the Nixon and Reagan administration using the crimes to discredit the hippie movement. Hubbard used the similarities to smear his enemies, and we know that he and the Scientology organization contacted the LA Times and other media outlets to make it sound as if there was a connection, as if the Church of Scientology were law-abiding citizens trying to help law enforcement to solve the crimes. They used it as a perfect way to permanently smear their enemies, the process. So my basic answer to that question, and I could go through every denial with everyone that Charlie was asked about the process. He always denied it. Paul Watkins, Lynette Fromme, many of the other people involved, none of them have ever described any connection to the process, and yet it's an undying rumor. And even when I have consistently denied it since 1988, when I first did the rounds of the TV talk shows promoting the first Manson File, when I've denied it, then people, it's a foolproof thing. People will say, well, he's denying it because he's part of the process, and he's protecting them. So you can't win. In denying this, people will say, well, that's the proof that it's really true. But in fact, there was no connection, and nobody will believe that because the story is more mysterious and fascinating than the banal truth. As far as I can see, Charles had no connection whatsoever, not only to the process, not to the Solar Lodge of the OTO, not to any other unnamed occult organization, and in fact, he was not interested in such things. He was very critical of all of them, including the Church of Satan, Aleister Crowley. He had nothing but contempt for all of these occult organizations, which he considered phony, and ultimately, he was basically a Christian. So the very idea that he would be involved in a satanic organization is ridiculous. If you really knew him and knew his kind of Gnostic Christian spiritual beliefs, it doesn't make any sense at all. So I hope that puts a nail in the coffin. That's from my personal experience with the man, and even what the LAPD, looking into the thing, concluded that this was a Scientology plot to smear the process.
Now, I'd also read that Charles had gone through over 150 hours of Scientological auditing. Is that true?
What is true is that a kind of dilettante was in prison with him and gave him amateur Scientology auditing, but he was not a qualified Scientology teacher, and this has been wildly exaggerated. His name was Lanier Raymer, and he was just I believe he was a burglar or a robber, armed robber, who was in the same cell as Charles in the early 60s. And Charles did identify himself in prison records as a Scientologist for a very brief period, but he himself never got actual training from the Scientology organization. It was not recognized by Scientology. This was an amateur Scientology enthusiast sort of doing a dilettante version of what is called auditing to Charlie, but there have been these claims that Charles was a recognized operating Thetan, which is a high level in the Scientology racket, and he wasn't. He basically just was exposed to Dianetics and the basics of Scientology thought, and he did identify himself as a Scientologist for a year or two, as even creepy Alvin Karpis from the Barker Gang describes in his memoir, that Charlie was interested in Scientology. But this was a brief phase he went through in the early 60s, and although he continued to use Scientology phrases for the rest of his life, he was not a practicing Scientologist, and he was never a member of the organization. And you can look into this fellow Lanier Raymer. He was not even an authentic Scientologist. And I print in the Manson File the secret Scientology report that L. Ron Hubbard had gathered about Bruce Davis, one member of the Manson commune, and Charlie, because, of course, Hubbard was very concerned to make sure that this infamous murder was not committed by a formally dues-paying, recognized Scientologist, and even Scientology themselves concluded in their secret report that he was not. So the most you can say, you can certainly find a few song lyrics and a few phrases in interviews and letters where Charlie refers to Scientological concepts, but he refers to concepts from all kinds of alternative religions. So it's, again, there's really not much to the Scientology connection. He definitely spoke favorably of it as something that helped him get through a depression in, I believe, the year 1960 with this guy Lanier Raymer's help, but he eventually tired of the dogmatic nature of it, and it was something he went through at a time when he was looking at very many spiritual systems. For instance, he was more influenced, and no one ever mentions this, but he himself described it, by the teachings of Yogananda, which was the Self-Realization Center in Los Angeles, was run by an Indian guru named Yogananda, and Charlie has admitted that some of his thinking was influenced by that. So no more than Yogananda or Dale Carnegie or many other sort of self-help proto-New Age ideas that Charlie looked at in the early 60s. Scientology was just one of many. It was not this central thing that, and I think it's a lot of enemies of Scientology push this idea to try to make Scientology seem more dangerous and evil.
Good evening. Was a young Montrealer a victim of the Manson family cult?
That's a question that's being asked today, 46 years after her death. Police in Los Angeles have identified the victim as 19-year-old Reet Jurvetson from Montreal. She was stabbed 150 times. Her body was found not far from the site of the Manson murders. Rob Lurie reports.
Reet Jurvetson was a typical 19-year-old, a free-spirited and happy person who liked to sew her own clothes. But her life came to a brutal end in the fall of 1969 when her body was found by a bird watcher near Mulholland Drive in L.A. She had been stabbed 150 times.
Over 100 stab wounds, that's definitely an overkill. We don't know if it was someone she knew, someone she didn't know.
Reet Jurvetson grew up in this house in NDG, but in late 1969 she headed to California after she met and became smitten with a man named John. Reet sent a postcard saying she was happy, but the family never heard from her again after that. Her parents, who had fled Estonia to come to Canada, never even called police.
They really did not know how the justice system works. They thought that, she's probably, just living out her life out west, and she's fine.
A body that would be referred to as Jane Doe 59 was found just a few miles away from where several Manson family victims were discovered. And there's long been speculation the cult led by Charles Manson was involved in this killing. Police even spoke with Manson in jail last year, but they got nothing.
There's never been any factual evidence linking anyone in his family or himself to this murder.
Police wouldn't have even known who Jane Doe 59 was, but late last year, Reet Jurvetson's high school friend Ilmi Seaman came across some pictures online of Jane Doe 59.
And I recognized her right away. I knew it was her. And so I went and called the Los Angeles Cold Case Department.
A DNA test finally confirmed the identity. In a statement, Reet's sister writes, "Finally, after all these years, we are faced with hard facts. My little sister was savagely killed. It was not what I wanted to hear, and now I have a lot to come to terms with."
She was just fun to be with. She didn't have a bad bone in her body.
LA police say no one deserves what happened to Reet Jurvetson. They want to find out who killed her and bring that person to justice.
There have actually been 2 unsolved murder cases that have been linked to Manson's community. One, as we just heard, was Jane Doe number 59, who's now been identified as Reet Jurvetson, and that was back in 1969. Well, 1 year earlier, in 1968, a Marina Habe was murdered, and there's been talk that both murders could have been perpetrated by the same group. Is this even within the realm of possibility?
I do not think so. In 30-some years of looking at this enigma, I have never found any evidence whatsoever, and even just not even from the LAPD was there any really serious suspicion of that. There was some investigation into it, and even the LAPD, at their most hostile to the Manson commune, did not find any clear link. Marina Habe got attention because she was the daughter of a well-known German author, and therefore it got international attention. And because of the sensational media coverage of the so-called Manson murders, she was sort of dragged into it. But the problem with the suspicion of anyone involved in the Manson group being involved with the murder of Habe and Jurvetson is that it is based on the fairy tale, on the legend, the myth, that the press and Bugliosi and the courtroom and the media pushed, that these were thrill-kill murders, that this was a gang of insane, drug-crazed hippies going around killing people at random for no reason. And if your listeners think through this logically, if it was about starting a race war, which it was not, but let's just be devil's advocate and say that it was, why in the world would a German woman and another white woman be murdered by this group of people? What in the world would be the point of that? Secondly, if other people who believe it was about copycat murders to free Bobby Beausoleil, which has become also a popular, but I believe false, theory to explain these crimes, what would the murder of two young white women do that in no way was a copycat? Thirdly, what it really was about was drug deal revenge. And, these people were not serial killers going around just stabbing people and sacrificing them to Satan for no reason. So the whole thing is illogical. This is not their MO. Shorty Shea was killed for the usual prison reasons that he was suspected of being a snitch. They were not going around marauding and murdering at random. Marina Habe, I don't think there has been any real evidence or proof that's come up in all these years to prove who murdered her or why. But Reet Jurvetson, actually, and a lot of people who irresponsibly spread this idea that she was one of the, quote, unknown or unsolved Manson victims, actually even her own family has never believed that, and they have looked into the much more logical and pragmatic explanation, and you can find this online, it's no secret, that Reet Jurvetson had visited California and possibly been kidnapped by a outlaw biker gang raped and murdered and left. And there was quite a lot of that sort of violence going on in California at that time. But that's just the typical mayhem of California. It only because it happened in the wake of the Tate-Labianca murders and the wave of fear that the press irresponsibly created for that by not doing any kind of proper journalism to look into what those crimes were about. There was an unreasonable fear that random murders of just anybody and everyone was occurring. So it's not that I'm saying there may not be other people who were murdered as a consequence of Tate-Labianca, but if they were, it had to do with covering up the crimes or further drug involved and narcotics traffic mayhem. It had nothing to do with random murders. So in a way, even answering the question brings Jurvetson and Habe into the case in a way that they really don't belong. And I do not put much credence into most of the rumors of unsolved murders, because that perpetuates Bugliosi's ridiculous claim that he was quite certain there are at least 35 other murders. And the problem with that whole way of thinking is that it keeps supporting the idea that they were just running around killing people for no reason, and that is a cover-up of the fact that there was a reason for these murders, as my book explains in detail.
I think, as with the JFK assassination, you have all of these things happening on the periphery of the case, and with many they get tied in an effort to investigate everything. Now, a few more examples. We have Manson's uncle, Darwin Orell Scott, who was murdered in Kentucky in 1969. We have Laurence Merrick, who co-directed the 1973 Manson docudrama. He was gunned down in 1977. And then we have Ronald Hughes, one of Manson's defense attorneys, and frankly not a very good one, who disappeared in 1970. Mm-hmm. Well, his body was discovered, severely decomposed, on March 29th of 1971, the very day that the jury returned death penalty verdicts for all the defendants in court. So these are the kinds of oddities that surround this case, and these are the kinds of things that interested researchers, I think, are naturally going to investigate.
Right.
Now, that said, that doesn't mean that there are direct links, but it does show that no matter how wide you cast the net in your investigations, you always catch something interesting.
Right. Well, I'm the first to say, and I've written and spoken about this extensively, there is an unbelievable amount of synchronicities and inexplicable weirdnesses about this case. And that's a whole other show you could do that could simply explore all of the almost unfathomable synchronicities and 6 degrees of separation between people involved with this case. And I mean, one of the most famous that is well known now that I mentioned in the first Manson File and in Charles Manson Superstar is Rosemary's Baby being filmed at the Dakota, and then John Lennon, who of course also became dragged into the Manson legend because of the supposed Beatles influence, being killed right outside the Dakota building, where there's a scene in Polanski's Rosemary's Baby, which is often associated with the Manson saga, because in that film, somebody kills themselves right there where Lennon was killed. That kind of synchronicity sums up the whole case. There are so many bizarre strands of this gigantic spider web that could be explored. But the particular ones you're describing is Manson's uncle was murdered in 1969, shortly before the crime spree of the Hinman, Tate-Labianca, Shea murders. And there has been speculation, because it was Charlie's uncle, that that was a murder-robbery. There's no proof that Charlie was in that area at the time. There is the almost urban legend that there was a hippie preacher seen in that area, but then again, this was 1969, and there were lots of communes and hippie preachers wandering all over America. So it's based on very tenuous. I mean, it seems that Scott was also, like many of the people in Charles' immediate family, also a crook and a criminal, and had plenty of other reasons he could have been murdered. So I can't completely rule it out, but I also have never seen any evidence whatsoever that the group was anywhere near that area when it happened, or that there's any proof that they were involved in the murder. Now, Laurence Merrick, again, is, if you look into the making of this Manson film, it's a very curious episode. Laurence Merrick was the co-director with Robert Hendrickson of a film called Manson, which began in a very strange way with an actor named Mark Ross introduced the director Robert Hendrickson to what he called a group of wannabe musicians. And these wannabe musicians ended up being the Manson commune. Now, how that came about was strange, because Mark Ross was appearing in a film, amateur, low-budget film Robert Hendrickson was making about, of all subjects, a hippie who is the second coming of Christ, which of course became a big part of the Manson legend. So that's very bizarre, that Hendrickson was making a film about the second coming of Jesus as a hippie. Ross introduced Hendrickson, and then they made, as I said earlier in the interview, this very bizarre scripted and staged film in which the members of the Manson commune were instructed to say lines and to perform as the Manson commune, the directors, wanted them to be. Now, Laurence Merrick was an Israeli, and, this gets into whole other digressions of conspiracy theories, not only an Israeli, but possibly an Israeli agent of some kind. His murder, now another odd coincidence, he was the acting teacher for Sharon Tate, of all people, long before the murders. So he knew Sharon Tate, and he became the filmmaker who produced and directed the first documentary about Charlie, which is strange enough. But as far as I know, and I looked into it, as I've looked into all of these mysteries on the fringes of the main crimes, he was killed by a psychopathic acting student in his acting studio, and there has never been proven that there's any connection between this lunatic who just shot him at the acting studio. There's no known connection whatsoever to the Manson commune, and there's no reason to believe Merrick had any particular knowledge of the crimes whatsoever. But it is certainly a strange case, and Merrick himself is an enigmatic and suspicious figure. So there's a reason why, the Scott and Merrick murders are definitely going to keep being looked at as unsolved possible connections to the Manson thing, but I don't think they are.
What about Manson's defense attorney, Ronald Hughes?
Well, Ronald Hughes, very briefly, it might disappoint people. Ronald Hughes was, as the media called him, a hippie lawyer who actually Charles at some point described as his publicity agent. He had been on the Spahn Ranch even before the murders, and Charlie, for some reason, trusted him to be an attorney. And though he was a completely incompetent and terrible attorney, like most of the defense team were, when you think of Bugliosi being this great prosecutor, he was up against a bunch of clowns who were just unable to perform the legal defense they were required to do. Ronald Hughes was this hippie lawyer, and he died. I am absolutely sure it had nothing to do with any kind of reprisal from the Manson family or because he knew too much or anything like that. As far as I can see, and I've looked into that in detail as well, he went camping and in a rural area, and a flash flood basically drowned him, hit him by surprise, and he was drowned in a flash flood, which is something that happened very frequently in that area to people who weren't familiar with the terrain and with the natural conditions there. So I think, again, that's just a bizarre coincidence that he died during the trial. And of course, in the paranoia and the media pushing of, this dangerous Manson family's out there killing people left and right, there's no proof that they did that. In fact, they didn't even kill people in their own group who had snitched on them. Like, for instance, Kitty Lutzinger, who was probably the first person to break a connection to the Inyo County Police about a connection between the Manson commune and the murders. She was sitting out there on the sidewalk with the other girls, even though she was the snitch that broke the case. So you got to look at things like that. Susan Atkins, who, confessed to the crimes and absolutely guaranteed that all of these people would go to prison or be killed. Nothing ever happened to her. So why would Ronald Hughes, of all people, be killed when many other people who directly were snitches, Paul Watkins, Atkins, Lutzinger, they were never harmed? So instead of getting hysterical about these things, you have to look at the cold, hard facts. After these drug dealing murders and the murder of Shorty Shea, which was just like a typical criminal killing of a supposed snitch, there's no reason for these murders to continue. So what would they have been about? That's the question you have to ask. So I think Ronald Hughes died in an unfortunate accident, and it's, people don't want to hear that. It's not as exciting as a cult being out there killing people.
You mentioned the work of Dave McGowan earlier. Now, many out there know him as the author for the mid to late 60s Laurel Canyon scene and how that tied into the CIA activity. And his book, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, is widely praised by people in the various research communities. But you have some thoughts on McGowan, particularly as he dealt with the Manson story.
Yes, I have many thoughts about Dave McGowan. And as I sort of indicated in the earlier part of the interview, in recent years, since the publication of the last Manson File, I would say that the Bugliosi's reputation has plummeted, and I think, although, of course, the idiot masses basically still accept helter-skelter, race war, random murders, more intelligent people and people who are actually looking into what the truth may be, I think, are starting to see how threadbare and really groundless the whole helter-skelter motive is. Because of that, in this vacuum, a lot of people are filling it in with even worse rumors and speculations that make even less sense than Bugliosi's theory. So it's not like just countering Bugliosi is good enough. It also has to be true. The problem with Dave McGowan, and I get I can't think of how many people have written to me or contacted me about McGowan, believing that his research, especially, I imagine you're speaking of his weird scenes in Laurel Canyon. A lot of people have been, that book, and I know there's many people who respect his work and think highly of him. The first thing I have to say about Weird Scenes in Laurel Canyon is I believe it is based on an incredible logical fallacy. What it claims is that the Laurel Canyon and Los Angeles rock counterculture, briefly, correct me if I'm wrong, I think this is his theory, was a test tube baby that was created by American intelligence, and the very tenuous proof that McGowan puts across for this theory is that many of the parents and relatives of the rock elite, such as Jim Morrison, his father being an admiral who was in Vietnam, and many other of the figures in the Los Angeles music industry who were pushing peace and love and LSD and mind expansion. If I understand McGowan's theory, he's claiming that because so many of the rock stars and influential musicians of the hippie period, and particularly connected to Laurel Canyon, because their parents and relatives were in the Navy, in the Army, in intelligence, many of them indeed were. However, to me, what is almost laughable about that, there was a little something called World War II. The generation of people who became the rock stars of the 60s were all war babies, baby boom babies, born right after or during World War II. And of course, most able-bodied men in America at that time were involved in the military, including intelligence. And I've looked at the book and I've looked at his theories, and I simply don't think they hold water. I think, again, as I said earlier, it's putting the cart before the horse. But I think that's a drastic historical mistake, because it's, of course, you could look at any industry at that time. There was this little something called the World War, put many able-bodied men in intelligence and the Navy and the military. So the fact that their children grew up to be rock stars does not prove that the rock and roll revolution of the 60s was a American intelligence agency plot. That's my feeling on that. I also don't think it's relevant in any way, especially to the Charles Manson phenomenon or to any of the crimes that occurred. I think there's zero connection. And now another point is, in talking about LSD and acid, which McGowan does a great deal, and a lot of the conspiracy theorists that accept his theory, I have taken LSD. I've experimented with most of the psychedelics when I was younger, and I think most people who have ever tried them would find it ridiculous that even, the most sinister intelligence op, they are unpredictable. You cannot use them to brainwash people. They are not state-of-the-art scientific tools for mind control. They are very uncontrollable. And the idea that has also been spread that MK Ultra, or what was more commonly known as Operation Artichoke, succeeded in breaking the code of how to brainwash people through LSD, which is often applied by Brussel and McGowan and other people as an indication that Manson was some kind of trained, either consciously or unconscious tool of the government who used this special kind of LSD to brainwash people. First of all, that isn't what happened. Secondly, if you look at the real files on MK Ultra, and if you look deeply into what really happened, which I have as part of another project which I'm working on, you will see that even people like Sidney Gottlieb, who were involved with MK Ultra, considered it a failure. They did not succeed in they would have loved to, but it didn't work as a brainwashing agent or a mind control agent. LSD and psychedelics are way too unpredictable for that. So I think people need to look into the actual MK Ultra And what's happened in recent years, people like Brussel and McGowan have created almost a fantasy of what the CIA and MK Ultra was. And it's certainly an interesting topic and worth looking into. And the experiments the CIA did on American citizens and foreign citizens are certainly unethical and hideous and horrific and should be investigated, and those people should have been prosecuted for crimes, but they weren't the crimes that they've been accused of, if you get where I'm going with that. So I don't think there's a connection in any way. And having known Charles for years, I just think it's laughable to think that he would be anybody's guinea pig or work for anybody, even if they wanted him to. He would be the worst possible agent you can imagine, and I think anyone who knew him would agree with that. I can understand why people who didn't know him may fill in the gaps of the mystery with that fantasy, but the real human being, I couldn't imagine him cooperating with anybody, let alone the CIA or any intelligence agency. Now, the final thing about McGowan, as I said, I wonder, did he ever try LSD? Did he ever really know what psychedelic drugs are like, which is significant to understanding this whole phenomenon. I would say if one hasn't, it's very hard to understand the thinking of the young people in the 60s who were involved in the counterculture, and very easy to mistake what they did and what they said just by imagining what psychedelics do to the mind rather than knowing. And the final thing, on a personal level, a lot of these people who accept McGowan's theory have never been, accused or been dragged into the kind of conspiracy theories he pushed. On a personal level, I have. For instance, in one of his earlier books, Program to Kill, The Politics of Serial Murder, he mentions me in that book, and he wrote, and I have the quote here, "Nikolas Schreck is also notable for his noticeable lack of a left ear, which he sliced off in a Van Gogh-like move intended to symbolize his allegiance to Satan." Now, when Dave McGowan was alive, what kind of researcher is he? He could have easily contacted me to ask if this ridiculous rumor is true, but he didn't. He printed it, and people believe that. So, on a personal level, I look at that and think, what kind of research did he do? Many people do know the true story of how my left ear was severed. For people that are fascinated with that episode, it's fairly well known. And it had nothing to do with symbolizing allegiance to Satan. It was an attack on me. And so when you see that McGowan could get something that wrong, and I see this all the time with other conspiracists who drag me into the Illuminati and occult symbolism and that sort of thing, the process, there are videos in which they take a quote out of context that I said in an interview from 1989 and fit it into their particular madness. So when you are the target of these kind of false conspiracy rumors, then that kind of thing, when I read that, it made me question how much serious fact-checking and research did McGowan do. And I think, if your name was dragged into his conspiracy research, you would take it a lot more skeptically when you see that he got his facts wrong about something that could easily be checked.
I'd now like to get your thoughts on the impact of Charles Manson's passing on the girls involved in the case and on Tex Watson, I guess, as well. But Susan Atkins died in 2009, and Linda Kasabian has been somewhat of a recluse, although she did appear on Larry King Live in 2009.
He was there on the 40th anniversary, and that is really worth looking at if anyone really interested in the case. Now, Linda Kasabian, as far as I'm concerned, was the co-instigator, at least, of the Cielo murders, because she was Tex Watson's lover and crime partner, and she was involved in the drug burn with Wojtek Frykowski, which was the reason they went back to that house, and she may well have had a lot more to do with the Labianca. In either case, She was already an experienced drug dealer and criminal and thief even before she met Tex Watson and Charlie. We can't get into all the details of that, but her attorney admitted that the story she told in court was total nonsense, that she just agreed to tell Bugliosi's story because that would save her life and she would not be sent to the gas chamber. I mean, her own lawyer admitted this was a fictional story that she told in court. But as far as I'm concerned, Kasabian is more guilty than the other women involved in this case. I have to preface what I say to that, but go ahead.
There's also Patricia Krenwenkel, who is currently the longest-serving female inmate in the state of California's history. And then we have Leslie Van Houten, who seems to be, over the years, the one that's been on the news the most. And she is also sort of always portrayed as the most amiable girl to the public, the one with the best chances for parole. So does Charlie's passing impact her parole chances?
I don't think so. I don't think so because I think, for one thing, Governor Jerry Brown, who is the current governor of California, was deeply enmeshed in the counterculturally inclined, drug-taking, nouveau riche hippies of the time. He was the boyfriend of Linda Ronstadt, who was connected to the whole singer-songwriter country rock movement that Charlie was really a part of. The whole Laurel Canyon and Topanga Canyon scene. Linda Ronstadt had even met Leslie Van Houten briefly when Van Houten was out before her second trial. People don't realize she was let out in the late 70s briefly, and she met Jerry Brown's girlfriend, Linda Ronstadt. So I think Jerry Brown, not only for his own political career, and I can't imagine any governor of California ever allowing any member of the Manson commune out, even though Steve Grogan was let out, which is very strange. Clem, or Steve Grogan, was let out because he revealed where the body of Shorty Shea was buried. But that's rather inexplicable because Steve Grogan, by the standards of the way the court handled the case, was just as guilty of the LaBianca murder as Susan Atkins, for instance. So that's a peculiarity. Why was Steve Grogan let out? Leslie Van Houten, I think it's very banal. It's that Leslie Van Houten is, by conventional standards, the most, quote, pretty and attractive of the women, the most normal seeming, and I think it's just a matter of Hollywood aesthetics. She looks like a nice girl, so therefore she should be let out. I don't think Patricia Krenwenkel is a danger to anybody in her old age. I'm not even sure that Tex Watson is, though I think he is a sociopath, and I think he's the main person behind these killings. And of course, I'm not losing any sleep about the fact that he will probably die in prison. But I don't necessarily think any of these people are a danger to society as elderly people who have totally renounced their former beliefs. But I don't see any reason that Leslie Van Houten is considered more tolerable to be allowed out than any of the others. I think it's sheerly a matter of superficial casting. Again, Hollywood idea. She's the pretty one, so therefore she must be the nice one. But if you really look at what she did, it seems to me she was perhaps one of the most deluded of all of them at the time. She may have really believed some of the fanciful mythology that has been attributed, if you listen to things she said. And also she seems to have really believed that by stabbing Rosemary LaBianca, that she really could somehow free her boyfriend, Bobby Beausoleil, who was her main squeeze at the time. Not Charlie, but Beausoleil was the main central relationship for Leslie Van Houten, or Lulu, at that time. So I don't see any reason why she should be considered particularly more, acceptable to society than Patricia Krenwenkel, except which one, wins the beauty contest. I think it's very superficial and shallow.
And I understand that perspective, especially in regard to what you told us last time, that Leslie Van Houten had, I'll just say, the most radical or the most extreme beliefs of all the girls.
I don't know if you can say the most radical and most extreme, but she wasn't this little innocent lost Pollyanna that has been described. None of them were. And, according to Arthur Lyons, who met her in 1968, and I think I mentioned this before, he had met her before she was involved in the Manson commune at an outwardly satanic commune of some kind. Now, that doesn't make her a murderer or a likely psychopath, but I just don't think she's better or worse than any of the others. I don't think Susan Atkins was a danger to society in her old age, as much as a, deluded, pathological liar that she was. Susan Atkins was very little involved in the actual murders and crimes. But again, it comes down to image. Susan Atkins looked sinister. She fulfilled the part of this 1960s occult, witchy type of woman, so therefore she is seen, you see a picture of her and on the internet people will immediately write monster, I'm glad she's rotting in hell. And Leslie Van Houten, people will say, oh, she's so pretty, what a waste. So it just comes down to typecasting to me.
You mentioned earlier that Lynette Fromme, commonly known as Squeaky Fromme, has a new book out. It was released August 1st, and it's called Reflection, Lynette Fromme's story of her life with Charles Manson, 1967 through 1969. Now, Reflection, as it's used in the title, I should mention, is spelled Reflexion. But how did she get the name Squeaky?
Well, whenever you ask any question about where the names of any of the people in the commune come from, like almost any aspect of this whole epic, there are so many different theories. For instance, Diane Lake, Snake, you could find at least 5 different explanations from herself, from Charles, from other people who were there when she got her name. So the story that I believe is most credible about Lynette Fromme is that George Spahn, who was the old man who owned the Spahn movie ranch in Chatsworth, he called her Squeaky because, now this is one of the stories, that when he would touch her, she would squeak. Now, there's some credibility to that in that George Spahn also gave Charles Watson the name Tex. So he, just as much as Manson, seems to have been the person who provided these nicknames. So, but that, I think, is the most credible story I've heard, that George Spahn gave her the nickname Squeaky, which I don't think she actually has used for decades. I could be wrong about that, but I believe not. Mostly people in the Manson community refer to her as Red, which was the name Charles gave her when he formed this Order of the Rainbow in the mid-70s, this ecological group that out of which came his outlaw philosophy. Just as Sandra Good is blue, Lynette Fromme is red, and even some of the other girls who were no longer loyal to Manson were given the names green, yellow, etc. But as far as the biography, it was recently published. It's called Reflection, and I have only recently received it and begun to read it, but I would absolutely recommend it to your listeners as a landmark on the Manson phenomenon. It's not a true crime book in any way, but it is a very sensitive and well-written memoir that captures the life and times of Lynette Fromme and her involvement in the commune. And by my standards, it gives one of the most honest portraits of Charles as a human being, and it is surprisingly objective and critical. If people imagine that it would just be the wild ravings and worshipful praisings of a disciple, she's actually quite objective and even critical of Charles, and it gives a very well-rounded portrait of her thoughts at that time, and it's maybe the first time any author who was deeply involved in the commune has written about these people as real human beings rather than mythical monsters. So I would highly recommend Reflection by Lynette Fromme, which you can find online.
Now, one of the recent bits of news came in 2014 when it seems like every news media imaginable reported that Charles Manson was engaged. Now, her name was Afton Burton. Charlie called her Star. And because it's time to play It's a Small World on the show, she was then from Alton, Illinois, which is about an hour and a half from our humble abode here. Now, I had heard that she attended the funeral as well, but how long did that engagement last?
Not very long, and I've spoken to Afton not long ago, and I've met her. And she is nothing like she's always compared in the popular press to Susan Atkins and, a mindless zombie follower of Charles Manson. She wasn't like that at all. She was drawn to Charlie because of her very deep and sincere belief in ecology. She really didn't know about or was even interested in the murders or the crimes or anything like that. Her main devotion and interest in Charlie was his ecological beliefs called Outlaw. I can't tell you exactly what the marriage was about, and because I know her, I don't really want to intrude on her privacy, but according to her, and I think she wouldn't have a problem with this being publicly known, the prison kept interfering with the ability to get the marriage license signed. And he was put in solitary confinement at a point, and then he began to get the final symptoms of the illness that eventually killed him. And so the marriage license could not be sealed, according to Afton, because the prison kept interfering with the ability to get it done, because he was in the hole. And then his illness, when he was sent to the hospital unit, it just couldn't happen. But there's been all kinds of ridiculous rumors about why they wanted to get married, and I discount them as just fanciful. What real reason Charlie wanted to do that, I couldn't speak for him or for Afton, but I would dispute any of the publicly promulgated rumors about it. And it seems to be it just sort of faded away because of circumstances that occurred in the prison and because of Charlie's illness, which did go on for quite a while, much longer than before it became public. He was already pretty ill. And so when he was in the hospital unit, it just wasn't possible. I think it's like many of these things that become legends, even in the recent aspects of this whole epic, I think it's a lot more down to earth and banal than people think.
That actually brings up a pretty good question. How many wives and how many children do you think can legally say that they were once either married to or born of Charles Manson?
Well, there's no doubt, and he spoke to me often, and there's not the slightest doubt about his legally acknowledged wives were Rosalie Willis, who he married, right before he came to Los Angeles, a young woman he knew from West Virginia. She had a child who was actually named Charles Manson Jr. and later changed his name to Jay White. Then there was a prostitute named Candy who he married simply as a matter of criminal convenience, because he had the idea, which was commonly believed, that if you're married to she was a prostitute in his small stable of whores in Laredo, Texas. And they got married because then it was believed that she would not be able to testify against him if they were married. That wasn't any kind of real romance. It was just a trick for the judge, and the judge didn't fall for it. They had a child. And then finally, Mary Brunner, as I mentioned, the first woman to become involved in the commune, gave birth to Michael Brunner, Pooh Bear, or Sunstone Hawk, in 1968. And those are the only known children of Charles. Of course, considering how promiscuous he was, who knows? There could certainly be others, but none of the other claimants have ever credibly proven that they are his children. I wouldn't doubt that there are, considering what even went on from 1967 to 69, it would be unlikely that nobody else got pregnant. But those are the three known wives and children of Charles.
It's such an interesting story, and I know it still has a hold on many in America. And I'm wondering where this story goes now that Charles Manson has passed. And when the newest update to the Manson File is released, what will surprise us most?
To tell you the truth, I'm probably too close to it to tell you what would surprise It depends on the level of knowledge. I mean, most people looking at this case would still be surprised to learn that helter-skelter was not the motive for the crimes. You know, it's very hard for me, because I'm way too close to it for 30 years, to know what would surprise people about it. From my impression, I would think the degree to which the rock industry lied about how close Charlie was to major players in the rock and roll world, how much Terry Melcher lied about his support of Charles' career, how deeply Dennis Wilson was practically a member of the commune. He was not just taken advantage of by the group, but he was a willing participant in the group. The fact that Dennis Wilson got involved with Charles because they were doing a drug deal at Gary Hinman's house, that this whole elaborate story about how Wilson met is not true. And I think in general, that's my main answer, is the Manson File, this final version of it, and the earlier one as well, basically debunks most of what you consider the mainstream narrative of this entire case, at least from 1967 to 1969. These are fairy tales, legends. That's why I call it a myth and a reality. Most of what you think you know about this case, when you really look at it, doesn't hold up. It's a lot of cover stories, rumors, self-created cover-ups, and also, I have to say, the cover-ups are on both sides, from the murderers, from the Hollywood people that were involved with it, and from law enforcement. So you have three different factions all covering up what really happened. But what I would imagine many things would shock people who have not looked deeply into the case. For people who are buffs or aficionados who have delved deeper, I think there will still be quite a few surprises. But I would imagine especially the degree to which the motives for the crimes were not what has been commonly believed, and the degree to which Charles was deeply enmeshed in the rock world of Hollywood in Los Angeles in 1967, 68, and 69, far more than anyone has realized. And that's why this has all been covered up, to protect the reputations of these people who, their reputations are destroyed by being involved with the name Charles Manson.
Well, your reputation, Nikolas Schreck, is very good with us. This has been Nikolas Schreck, the author of the Manson File, Myth and Reality of an Outlaw Shaman, and the director of Charles Manson Superstar. So, if anyone out there wants to follow you online or find out more information about you, how can they do that?
Through all the usual methods that one is sort of forced to utilize in our degenerate age. So there's a Nikolas Schreck official Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, website, and all the rest, which can easily be discovered through Big Brother Google. And there's also a closed Manson File Myth and Reality Facebook group, which I started on Charlie's birthday of last year. So when the book is released, that will be the first place it will be announced. And I am fairly accessible in that group, though I'm not usually present online. So if people have questions about the case, and if they're serious about understanding what this is all about, there are many other serious researchers and people who are interested in this case in that Facebook group, particularly called the Manson File Myth and Reality Official Circle.
Nikolas, thank you so much for joining us with our last show, and with this one, we've provided the people with over 6 hours of content. Absolutely enough to dive into, so I hope they'll listen to both shows and And thank you so much for being here. You've been real kind.
Thank you, SG, and I appreciate your support.
I'm SD Patrick. This is the Midnight Rider News Show. And at 3 hours and 30 minutes, we're not going to have any final thoughts tonight. I'll spare you of those. But I do want to leave you again, like we did with our last episode, with a song by Charles
Manson. News@gmail.com. Join us on Facebook at Midnight Rider News Show. Follow ST Patrick on Twitter at MWN_ST Patrick. We are LinkedIn at S.T.Patrick. And don't forget to follow Midnight Rider News on your YouTube, iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and many of your favorite podcast providers. This has been a production of MidnightRiderNews.com and ST Patrick. Copyright 2018. All rights reserved. We'll see you next time, and be good to the night.